After Carl introduced Nick, nobody reacted. "Nick," Carl said in an authoritative voice, turning to Nick again. "During this mission, you are part of my team. When we are outside, it is imperative that you listen to my orders. I would also ask you to minimize the chatter unless it is mission-related. Do you understand?" Nick nodded, "Of course." "Will you follow my orders?" Carl asked. "I will," Nick answered neutrally. Carl nodded. "Good. The mission will most likely take between 16 to 24 hours. Can you afford to stay away for this period of time?" "I can," Nick said. "Then we're going to leave right now. Nick, your position is beside Mark. Stay close to him and keep an eye out." "Yes," Nick answered as he approached Mark, the mid-veteran manipulator with his two guns. Mark threw a short, polite smile at Nick, but it vanished as soon as he looked away. It was not difficult for Nick to see the team's true opinion of him. They weren't trying to keep it secret. This was a team that had worked together for years, and the last time they'd had a fourth member was over a decade ago. The three of them relied on each other, and all of them trusted the others with their lives. This was Solace's most experienced team, and they had been outside the city over 100 times over the years. And now they had to escort an inexperienced, young veteran from another manufacturer because of politics. The three of them had one job: to find and capture Specters. Or did it say in their contracts that they now also had to be babysitters? If Nick died outside, the fallout for Solace would be tremendous. Sure, Dark Dream wasn't huge, but they still gave Solace help worth over 10 million credits per month. Additionally, while the group didn't think much of Nick, they thought highly of Julian, and killing Nick might anger him. They essentially had to carry Nick around outside, and they couldn't afford to let him die. Sadly, they didn't have a choice. Hera thought very highly of Nick, and she kept telling Carl that Nick would be a great help to them outside. Additionally, helping Dark Dream was equivalent to helping themselves. She kept telling Carl not to underestimate Nick. Dark Dream had come out of nothing, and Nick had been their CZE for 9 years by now. Dark Dream had grown a scary amount in that time, and without a great CZE, they would have long since stopped existing. Carl believed Hera that Nick was probably an amazing CZE. However, traveling outside was something completely different from running a manufacturer. A CZE had to know how Specters operated, how to run a business, how to work with Specters, how to organize, and a couple more things related to the business. CZEs did not need to be strong in battle. CZEs did not need to know how the outside world worked. Sure, Nick might be an amazing CZE, but given his young age and inexperience, he couldn't possibly have the skill set required for a mission this big. Nick was supposed to look around the 5 kilometers surrounding the city to get a feel for the outside world. Meanwhile, Carl and his team always went far from the city to search for Specters. These areas were not properly mapped, and they could fall prey to any unknown Specter. Additionally, this far from the city, there was also a chance they'd meet somebody from another city. That was almost always bad. The rules dictated that nobody was allowed to kill another extractor from their own city. There was nothing about not killing someone from a different city. Extractors who traveled this far from their cities were powerful and rich. Just their barriers cost millions of credits. And since it wasn't exactly illegal to kill people from different cities, those barriers could be sold. Carl's team of 4 was worth over 30 million credits. Even specialists would be interested in that much money, unless it required too much work to attain. Going far from the city was extremely dangerous, and the last thing the team needed was deadweight to carry, like Nick. So yeah, all in all, the team did not think highly of Nick. Carl left the building and Mark followed. Naturally, Nick stayed close to Mark. The last person leaving was Erwin. "Just stay close and everything will be fine," Mark said, his tone friendly. Nick nodded, "Of course." Mark smiled, but it vanished again when he looked away. Obviously, he was just trying to be nice when, in truth, he really didn't want to. The 4 of them ran around the megastructure until they were north of it. Then they walked toward the edge of the city. "Have you jumped over the gap before?" Mark suddenly asked. "No," Nick said. "That's fine," Mark added. "Carl will make sure to catch you." Nick just nodded again. The 4 of them stopped near the northern edge of the city. "Nick, you go after Mark. When jumping, err on the side of using too much power instead of too little," Carl said. "Remember to always keep your eyes closed. Close them before you jump and don't open them until you hit the ground." "Understood," Nick said. Carl nodded. Xiang, and he shot towards the north at insane speed. In an instant, he broke through the red curtain of mist. Just do it like I do, Mark told Nick as he readied himself. Bang! Mark charged forward, and after a couple of steps, he jumped with all of his power. Just like Carl, Mark vanished into the red mist. Chapter 402, Jump. Nick took a deep breath. He had never jumped over the gap before. Jumping over the gap meant crossing the 1 to 1.5 kilometers between the city's edge and the outside world. A very athletic initial veteran could accomplish that, but it was extremely risky. Extractors were allowed to leave the city this way, but they had to get permission from a city captain first. However, while jumping out of the city was okay, jumping in was forbidden. The main reason was that, with closed eyes, the extractor couldn't properly control their fall, which would result in people dying and houses getting destroyed. The northern part of the city was nearly as close to the outside world as the southern part, which was the closest. Ignoring the bridge, the southern part of the city was only about a kilometer from the outside world. It used to be more, but the city had grown quite a bit. Nick took a deep breath, narrowed his eyes, and focused on the street in front of him. Xiang. Nick rapidly accelerated without making any noise. Then he jumped, closing his eyes at the same time. Bang! Nick shot forward, and a bit of light from his activating barrier managed to get through his eyelids. Nick had jumped with a lot of force to make sure he didn't fall into the Crimson Sea. Nevertheless, he was still nervous. Jumping into the unknown was always terrifying. Bang! Keep your eyes closed, Nick heard Carl's voice from in front of him. Carl had caught Nick, and the two of them were now falling. Bang! Carl landed while keeping Nick stable. You can open them now, he said before stepping away. Nick slowly opened his eyes and saw the outside world. It was brown and lifeless like always. Nick took a deep breath. Thanks. Carl didn't answer. Right now, Carl, Nick, and Mark were in a small valley north of the city. South of their position was the wall surrounding the Crimson Sea. Carl kept looking upward. You shot out with quite a lot of speed, Mark said, sounding surprised. You could have flown another 500 meters probably. Bang! At that moment, a black object shot out of the red curtain. Carl immediately jumped and intercepted it. It was Erwin. Veterans had a terrifying amount of power, and the speed at which they jumped out was terrifying. As a mid-veteran, Nick could move at speeds of over 500 kph, and if he put everything into a jump, he could reach nearly 700 kph. Because of that, Erwin looked like he'd been fired from a cannon. Come stay close, Mark said, walking towards Carl and Erwin. Carl motioned forward, and everyone followed. Nick and Mark ran past Erwin, who fell in behind them. Nick had only been to the south and east of the city. He had not yet been to the west or the north. However, he knew what was around the city. Far to the southwest was the iron mine. Directly west was the isolated field with the carbon plants, the carbon field. West of the carbon field was the land of desires, the reason the city had placed the carbon field where it did. The land of desires was an area about 2 kilometers wide, completely covered in delicious food and drink. Huge trees filled with fruit, bushes filled with nuts, crystal clear waters, flowers filled with sweet nectar, cooked chickens growing out of the ground, cooked meat hanging from trees. Of course, the land of desires was a specter, and eating anything from there was a bad idea. If someone ate from it, they would grow addicted instantly. Without interference, the person would remain inside and gorge themselves to death. Even if somebody could be pulled away, the withdrawal symptoms were brutal. Shivers, panic, terror, aggression, heart palpitations, fever, existential dread, suicidal thoughts, and more. If someone ate from the land of desires, their chances of death were over 60%, even assuming immediate medical attention. The carbon fields occupied the area between the city and the land of desires. The reason was the slimes. The slimes attacked the land of desires just as they attacked the forests. The only difference was that the land of desires didn't lose any Zephyx. The Specter was present and simply used its natural defenses to fight off the slimes. This didn't work for the forests since they weren't the Specter itself. They were minions, objects of power belonging to the real Specter. They had limited batteries, which couldn't be refilled. The land of desires created an amazing defense for the carbon fields, leaving only the north, northeast, south, and southeast open to attack. The northwest, west, and southwest didn't need defending, and the east was occupied by the Crimson Sea. What about the north of the city, where Nick currently was? Well, there wasn't much. While the other areas around the city had many noticeable specters, the forests, slimes, infestors, corrosive dust, desert, land of desires, there was no noticeable specter to the north. And that was concerning. Why were there specters around every other part of the city, while there was none to the north? Nobody really knew. Was there a specter that stopped all other specters from coming here? Maybe, but nobody had gone missing in that area over the past 20 years. Everyone who ran through it survived without incident. Nevertheless, traveling through the area was quite creepy. In a way, the complete absence of specters made this place especially unsettling. Chapter 403, The Forbidden Zone. The four of them ran north. Everything around Nick was just wasteland. There were a couple of hills here and there, but that was it. Brown and beige nothingness everywhere. After running about 10 kilometers, they turned east. By now, no trace of human civilization could be seen. No people, no cities. Just a dead world. As they kept running east, Nick sometimes glanced north nervously. While there was nothing close to the city in the north, that was bound to change the further they went. About 15 kilometers from the city, it did. Even though Nick was still about 5 kilometers from the Forbidden Zone, he kept glancing that way. The Forbidden Zone started 15 kilometers north of the city and extended an unknown distance. The city did not know what was inside it or what it looked like. They only knew one thing. Every single person who had ever crossed the line had died. Even a hero had vanished there once. Many years ago, one of the city's heroes thought they were strong enough to enter the Forbidden Zone. They never returned. That was one of the biggest reasons Blitz managed to rise to power. The hero had belonged to the biggest manufacturer before Blitz claimed that title. The running theory was that a neutral fallen lived there. Adversaries often affected gigantic areas, their influence visible across many places. Yet the Forbidden Zone seemed more localized, which most likely meant a fallen lived there that didn't view humanity as its enemy. Either way, entering the Forbidden Zone was akin to suicide. The team kept running east, always staying about 5 kilometers from the Forbidden Zone. After about 10 kilometers, Nick looked south. Right now, they should be about 5 kilometers north of the desert. Since going further north was suicide, the group was leaving eastward instead. They had first traveled so far north to avoid attracting attention from anyone in the desert. The team's goal was the wilderness far east of the city, and the best way to get there unnoticed was to jump the gap and run east while staying close to the Forbidden Zone. The four of them continued running, and soon even the desert was far to the west. Right now, Nick was over 20 kilometers from the city, the furthest he'd ever been. While the surrounding 10 kilometers of the city were common knowledge, anything further was kept secret. Scouting the surroundings took a lot of work, and manufacturers didn't want to share their findings with each other. So, while some very noticeable areas weren't kept secret, everything else was. For example, there was an area east of the desert and south of Nick's current location, an extensive cave system. There were many holes and crevices in the ground leading into the earth. These crevices and caves span an area of 4 kilometers, arranged in a rough X. Crimson City suspected at least one Specter lived inside, but not much else was known about it. Many manufacturers had looked into it, but none said how far they'd gone or what they'd found. However, the cave system wasn't the group's goal either. While not directly adjacent to the city, it was still too well known. They were bound to run into other extractors there. They had to go further. So they kept running. After another 10 kilometers, Nick was now over 30 kilometers from the city. Now things were starting to get dangerous. At this distance, it was no longer realistic to run back to the city for help if attacked. There were also far fewer extractors out here, which was both good and bad. Good because the chances of being found were lower. Bad because there were no witnesses if anything happened. Nick had officially entered territory he knew nothing about. He didn't know of any big landmarks or specters this far from the city. He didn't even know if the Forbidden Zone still extended this far. In fact, not even the city knew. Since the Forbidden Zone couldn't be seen, the city had no way to find out whether it was safe to go north here. Finding out would require sending someone and would most likely kill them. Even using criminals to scout wouldn't yield new information. If the forbidden zone was still there, the criminal died. If not, they just keep walking north to escape. Either way, the city would learn nothing. Of course, Carl's group had no plans to find out whether the forbidden zone extended this far. In fact, they were slowly shifting direction toward the southeast instead of due east. What if the forbidden zone curved? They didn't want to take the chance. For the past couple of minutes, nobody had said a word, and Nick just followed silently. But after a few more kilometers southeast, Carl finally spoke. "Want to see something interesting, Nick?" Carl asked. "Take it as a present from solace to dark dream." Naturally, presents were never really presents. A present between companies was a show of goodwill, and goodwill was expected to be returned. Information about the outside world was precious, and Carl naturally wanted to cash in on that. Nick knew what Carl meant. "Always," Nick answered. Solace and dark dream worked very closely together, and there was no issue in accepting something like that. In fact, refusing such a gift might even be considered rude. Chapter 404, Endless Blue. The four of them continued running east. Eventually, they reached a distance of 40 kilometers from the city. This was now the true unknown. Suddenly, Carl slowed down. In front of Nick were gray cliffs, quite different from the beige and brown ones everywhere else. In a way, these cliffs appeared clean. The smell in the air was also different, familiar, though Nick couldn't place it. Carl slowly and carefully approached one of the big cliffs and motioned Nick closer. Mark and Erwin ran to the side, hiding while surveilling the area. "Stay close," Carl whispered to Nick, "and don't make any noise. Additionally, do not use your Zephyx in any way, even if you want to use it to remain quiet." Nick frowned. Staying quiet without using Zephyx. That felt contradictory, but Nick nodded and followed Carl's orders. Carl slowly and quietly pulled himself up one of the cliffs. Nick quietly followed. The cliffs were only 10 to 20 meters high, and they reached the top quickly. Carl looked at Nick and motioned for him to come closer, then gestured for him to look over the edge. Nick slowly moved his head to look over. Then his eyes widened. Blue waves crashed against the cliffs as the familiar scent of salt blew through the air. Nick could see a 2-kilometer-wide body of crystal-clear water. It was difficult to come to terms with what he was seeing. He had heard of the concept of a lake and sea, but never a specific one. As Nick finally recognized the scent as salt, another realization struck. Salt, according to Julian, only the biggest bodies of water in the world are made of salt water. Nick felt Carl touch his shoulder, trying to get his attention. Nick looked back, and Carl gestured further to the left. Nick did and saw the body of water extending. While it only stretched about 2 kilometers to the south, the same wasn't true to the north. Endless. The 2-kilometer-wide channel of water expanded further and further until the water was everywhere. But if that's the case, Nick thought, turning towards the northwest, isn't the forbidden zone also covered in salt water? Could it be that the forbidden zone is a huge body of water? Nick turned northeast again and looked at the endlessness of water, mesmerized. Near the shore and the cliffs, the water was almost white. Further out, it turned blue. But eventually, beneath the still blue surface, a murky blackness lurked. Nick knew these parts were most likely so deep that no light reached the bottom, making it look like a black void. And yet, as he kept looking, he felt like something was moving inside it. Carl got his attention again and motioned for him to come down, then started descending the cliff quietly. Nick watched him go, then his eyebrows rose as he looked for Mark and Erwin. He couldn't find them. He looked back at Carl, focused on his silent climb. None of the three could see him. Then why? Didn't my ability activate again? Nick thought, his heart rate spiking. Nick ducked behind the cliff. His ability had reactivated. Nick started to sweat. He looked over the cliff again at the huge body of water. His ability deactivated. Nick searched desperately for anything moving. Something was looking at him. But nothing had happened yet. Nick had been looking at the water for over a minute now. Anything that could threaten him could easily have reached him in that time. And yet nothing had happened. What the hell is going on? Nick thought, staring into the darkness of the water again. Is something moving in there or not? It didn't look like it. And yet Nick felt like something was moving. The endless darkness in the water. Was it moving? After a moment, Nick felt like tentacles made of darkness were squirming below the surface, and the horizon seemed darker than usual, almost like storm clouds were gathering. Then something caught his eye. Far away, Nick could see a small object above the surface, a long, thin stick, tiny, seeming to rise out of the water. Nick stared at it. Suddenly, he felt something tap his leg and looked down. It was Carl, glaring at him with a serious expression, motioning for him to come down. Nick held out his arm in a stopping gesture and pointed towards his ears, then to the water. He wanted to convey that he was sensing something. Nick had told everyone he was a sensor, and one should always listen to what a sensor had to say. Carl understood and frowned, then gestured upward after a second. Nick nodded and looked back at the ocean. The stick had grown, over twice as big now. Nick's heart rate spiked as he focused on it. Then it grew some more, and something wide appeared near its base. The stick grew even more, and the wide part lengthened with it. Nick fully focused on the object. This was an object from the Forbidden Zone. Then Nick realized what was happening. The object wasn't growing, it was coming closer. Combined with the fact that he knew he was being sensed, the truth dawned on him. This thing was coming for them. Chapter 405, One Friend. Something's coming, Nick shouted, immediately jumping away from the cliff. The hearts of all three of Nick's teammates nearly jumped into their throats at the sudden shout breaking the silence. They already know we're here, but they don't know that we know, Nick shouted urgently as he landed. Shut the fuck up, Erwin shouted aggressively. You're blowing our. We can't run, Nick shouted back. They're too fast, follow me. Carl looked at Nick with narrowed eyes. Had Nick gone insane? Did the Forbidden Zone have some kind of effect on a person's mentality? Bang! Nick punched the ground with all his power, and a huge crater appeared. The team's eyes widened in shock. That must have echoed for a kilometer. Bang! Nick punched the bottom of the crater half a second later, opening a hole over 5 meters deep. Follow my lead or die, he shouted. The debris he'd thrown into the air came raining back down on top of him. Most scattered outside the crater, but plenty was left to bury the bottom 2 meters of the hole. Nick dropped flat to the ground. A normal human would have been bludgeoned to death by the falling rock and sand, but it couldn't hurt a veteran. Carl's mind was racing. He believed Nick had gone insane. But he also remembered the trust Hera had put in Nick, and that Nick had allegedly survived an ambush of 10 extractors. Carl wasn't sure he believed that. How could one person survive when 10 similarly powerful extractors combined their strength to kill him? Sure, he might kill 2, but the other 8 attacks would hit at once, and nobody could survive that. Carl was conflicted. But as an experienced leader, he decided quickly. Do what he says, he ordered. An earthen shield appeared in front of him, and he jumped into a dune of dust and stone. Surprisingly, it didn't shatter. Carl slipped into it like he was part of the dune. Erwin was furious at Nick, but his leader had given an order and he complied. A light appeared around him, and he blurred as he bent down to lie flat. Mark had already vanished. All 3 were extremely experienced, and each had their own way to stay hidden. Silence. The area seemed completely empty, just debris scattered around, unremarkable in a world that already looked like this everywhere. Deep underground, Nick didn't dare move. His ability had activated again, meaning nobody was currently perceiving him. He hoped it wouldn't deactivate. If it did, he would die. Several seconds passed. Taboo. Nick felt a light vibration from above. Something or someone had stepped on the ground over him. Silence. Tab tab. 2 more vibrations. Tab 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 tab. More vibrations, like several feet walking over the ground. Nick didn't dare move. Silence. A couple more taps. No, please spare me, I'll tell you everything. Nick's heart rate spiked at the sound of Mark screaming and pleading. Whatever was up there had found Mark. Silence. I don't know what you want, can't you just tell me please? Mark shouted nervously. Silence. I don't know what you're trying to say. Nick didn't dare move. Fine, fine, I'll tell you, Mark shouted, but please let me live, okay? Nick didn't move. Okay, yes, I'm here with a friend. Please take him instead of me, okay? A rush of fear and hatred went through Nick. One friend. This fucker was selling him out to save his own skin. He's there, he's the one you saw earlier. He burrowed into the ground there. At that moment, Nick's ability began to fluctuate, switching between active and inactive rapidly. Nick knew what this meant. Over the years, he'd felt this before. It happened whenever someone believed they knew where Nick was, and were right. For example, if Julian told Jenny that Nick was working with a talker, Nick's ability would fluctuate. That was because Jenny knew where Nick was without technically sensing him. The important part was that she believed she knew, and was actually right. If Julian told Jenny that Nick was not in the building while he actually was, the ability wouldn't fluctuate. In both cases, Jenny believed she knew where Nick was, but only in the first case would it fluctuate. To properly deactivate it, one needed to actually sense Nick. To make it merely fluctuate, one had to pin down his location to within a couple of meters. Just telling someone Nick was somewhere in Dark Dream's building wouldn't do it. That was far too large an area. The fact that his ability was fluctuating now meant Mark had pointed straight at him. Whatever was up there believed Nick was buried below this spot, and they were right. "Please, I told you where he is. Can't you just please no, please?" Mark's pleading grew quieter and more distant. Nick could tell he was being pulled away. Apparently, whatever was up there hadn't killed Mark, but kidnapped him. Nick felt his ability fluctuating constantly. Tab tab. 2 taps came from directly above him. Nick's mind raced, desperate for a way out. Boom! Everything around him exploded. Chapter 406, East. The ground exploded into a shower of debris and dust. Bang! Bang! More and more explosions scattered more and more debris and dust. A humanoid figure stood in front of a cluster of craters, each about 10 meters deep. The figure was red, covered in growths that weren't blood or flesh, hard as bone and spiky. Half its face was human, the rest was covered by the growths. The single eye on the left half of its face held no glimmer of independence. The red growths looked almost identical to coral. It was like somebody had been infested by coral. 3 more humanoids were scattered around the area, equally coral-infested. All of them stared at the craters without moving. They waited. There was nothing there. Bang! Then the one who destroyed the ground jumped into the distance, covering 2 kilometers in an instant. Bang, bang, bang. The other 3 jumped after it, several times slower, all heading southwest. Around the craters, the dust clouds slowly settled. Yet a moment later, one of them stealthily drifted into a crater. Bang! Nick appeared inside, his entire body drenched in sweat. He rapidly dug into the ground, and a second later he was gone. Buried beneath the crater, Nick fought to stay conscious. The attack had nearly drained all his Zephyx. He transformed into mist just before it hit. When the humanoid kicked the ground, it scattered a ton of debris and dust, and Nick had turned to mist, hoping to hide among the clouds. A human body would have been spotted instantly, but a wisp of mist amid dust clouds wasn't nearly as noticeable. Like the debris, he'd been pushed outward, and like the dust, his misty body had lingered. As the humanoids kept tearing up the ground, more dust rose, keeping him hidden. Fortunately, they left after just a couple of seconds. Most likely, they thought Mark was protecting me, that he told them I was here when I'd actually run for the city. Nick gritted his teeth. Their opinion of him sure was high, he thought with hatred. Now that the immediate danger had passed, his rage at being betrayed surged to the surface. This fucker wanted to pull me down with him. Over a minute passed in complete silence. "It's gone." Nick heard Erwin's voice. "Silence." "Nick, where are you?" Carl shouted next. "Whatever it was, it's gone. You can come out." Nick narrowed his eyes, burying the rage deep inside, then rose out of the ground and looked around. Carl appeared at the edge of the crater at the sound of moving earth, a serious expression on his face. "No time to waste," he said. "I don't want to stay here. We need to leave immediately." Nick glared at him but complied. He jumped out of the crater and saw Erwin glaring at him. Carl ran north. Nick was surprised, since the forbidden zone lay that way. He understood when Carl stopped after just 500 meters. Carl approached a spot between 2 rocks, dug his hands into the ground, and lifted. A huge slab of ground rose, its underside made of metal, a lid. Below it was a dark hole. Carl touched a switch on the wall, and the hole lit up with artificial lights, likely also useful against the nightmare. After all, Carl and Erwin were from Solace, which specialized in lights that worked against it. Erwin jumped in, and Nick followed. Once inside, Carl sealed the lid behind them and followed. The hole became a tunnel a couple of meters down, curving so steeply it was almost a slide. Erwin ran through it, Nick and Carl close behind, until the tunnel leveled out again. After about 2 minutes, it curved upward into a slope they had to run. Eventually, Erwin pushed open another lid and climbed out. Nick followed. Behind them, Carl hit a switch, darkening the tunnel and sealed the lid. "We can talk over there," Carl said, gesturing east. The three of them ran about 3 kilometers to a cluster of big boulders in the wasteland, then stopped. Nick could roughly place where he was. The tunnel had run east beneath the body of water and come up on the other side. Then they'd run another 3 kilometers east of that. Nick was now about 3 kilometers east of the big body of water, roughly 50 kilometers from the city. Quite far from home. The three of them caught their breath. Then Carl turned to Nick. "Can you explain to me what just happened?" Chapter 407, No Evidence. "That's what I would like to know," Nick said, his voice severe. "Your friend told them where I was. Your friend tried to fucking kill me." Carl gritted his teeth. "Shut up," Erwin shouted from the side. "This is all your fault anyway. You were the one who led this thing to us in the first place. Mark didn't kill you, you killed Mark." "That was not my fault," Nick said, seething. "I acted just like your leader. If they saw me, they'd have seen him too." "You were up there way longer than Carl," Erwin shouted, gesturing aggressively west. "I saw him coming down way earlier than you, and I even saw him go back to get you. You led this thing to us. You even knew it was coming." "That's because I'm a censor," Nick answered. "From what I've seen, one of these things has the power of a fucking fanatic. If it had seen me, we wouldn't have been able to hide in time. It would have arrived within a second." "Then how could you possibly say it didn't see you if it was that strong? For that matter, why didn't it arrive within a second? As far as I can see, nothing was coming toward us until you punched the ground like a lunatic," Erwin shouted back. "I can assure you they'd already noticed us before that. If it weren't for me, the two of you would be dead right now." "Quiet," Carl suddenly shouted, looking at both of them. "Arguing like this won't achieve anything." "He's the reason Mark is dead," Erwin shouted, throwing an accusatory finger at Nick. "And how do you know that?" Carl asked, turning to Erwin. "I looked at the sea longer than he did, and nothing happened. I told him to be quiet because the area behind the cliff is very open, and there's a high chance an extractor from the city might be there. They run experiments on the sea all the time, and I've seen extractors swimming in it. Why weren't they found out? Are you telling me Nick is more noticeable than several extractors standing right in front of the water?" "Then it was bad luck, sure," Erwin said, not letting up. "But the thing could still have seen him while you were coming back." Carl put his hand on Erwin's shoulder and looked him in the eye. "Mark was my friend too," Carl said. "I'm filled with anger over his death, but accusing Nick will just get more people killed. Right now, there's no evidence that he's the reason this Specter appeared." Erwin gritted his teeth and clenched his fists, then glared at Nick with fury. Nick just looked back, eyes narrowed. Erwin turned and walked out of the boulder formation. "I'll keep a lookout," he said, anger and hatred barely repressed. Of course, he just wanted to get away from Nick. If he stayed, he might not keep himself in check. Carl turned to Nick. "I need to know what happened and what you saw. You keep saying they. Was there more than one?" Nick looked at Carl, eyes narrowed. "Do you think keeping him from blaming me makes me feel indebted to you? You forget that your so-called friend told them where I was and tried to kill me," Nick said venomously. "Nick, just as there's no evidence you attracted these things, there's no evidence Mark told them where you were. You're still here, right? By your own admission, one of these things has the power of a fanatic. If Mark had told them exactly where you were, you wouldn't be here now. Maybe he gave them the wrong location." Nick froze. What the fuck did Carl just say? No evidence. This fucker Mark told them where he was. That was what made Nick's ability fluctuate. And that thing had stopped right on top of his location before cratering the exact spot. Nick fell silent, eyes wide with fury, staring into Carl's. "No fucking evidence," he said. "Oh, I get it," Nick thought, eyes narrowing slowly. "This traitor Mark belonged to Solace, and if Carl admits Mark tried to kill me, Solace might be in huge trouble. This is about money, huh?" His hot anger turned to cold hatred. "While friendship between businesses always relies on mutual benefit, I would have thought you smarter than this, Hera. Is this how you trained your vice CZE? He sees Solace might have to pay, and instead of paying to secure the partnership, he'd rather ruin the alliance entirely just to avoid it. Or maybe you plan on getting rid of me so you don't have to pay anything. How disappointing. I genuinely considered you my ally," Nick thought coldly. I see, he said, his voice eerily calm. That's how we're doing this. Carl furrowed his brows. He was genuinely concerned. The shift in Nick's demeanor was far too abrupt. Are you planning on silencing me? Nick asked coldly. Carl's eyes widened in shock. Is your friend aiming his gun at me right now? Nick said. You think you can catch me, after not even those things managed to? He looked deep into Carl's eyes, confident. Chapter 408, Image. Wait, Carl shouted. What silencing, what killing, what are you talking about? Nick's eyes darted around the formation, looking for Irwin. Most likely, Irwin already had his gun readied. Nick, you have to calm down, Carl said seriously. Nobody's trying to kill you, I'm asking what happened. Nick sneered in disgust. Do you honestly think I'm that dumb? You already made your stance clear. What stance? Carl asked, frustrated and confused. I just want to know what the hell is going on. No evidence, Nick sneered. You must have heard Mark's shouts too. He told them he was here with a friend, then pointed at my location. Then the area around me exploded and I ended up in the middle of a crater. No evidence, no evidence. You act like you heard nothing when you were even closer to the surface than me, with better senses. You saw me getting punched in the face and claim the punch never happened. Uncertainty crept onto Carl's face as Nick kept talking. The area around you exploded, he asked, his voice losing some of its edge. You heard the explosion, Nick said, even though you claim you were somehow blind and deaf that whole minute. I'm not claiming that, Carl said sharply. I heard the explosion, I felt the vibrations, I was scared it was about to find me. Nick narrowed his eyes, skeptical. Nick, is that the truth? Are you sure Mark told this thing where you were? Nick kept staring at him in suspicion. Carl took a step forward. Bang! Nick jumped 2 meters back instantly, blades ready. Nick, stop, Carl shouted, taking 2 steps back to show he didn't plan to attack. Nobody wants to kill you. You think I believe you? Nick asked coldly. You think I'm that naive just because I'm in my 20s? Almost all humans only care about their own wealth and don't give a shit about anyone else. Your friend tried to take me down with him, and instead of doing what's right, you want to silence me so Solace doesn't lose any profit. Whoops, sorry, Dark Dream's CZE was taken by a couple of funny red men from the north. Sorry. We can take your next CZE with us on another expedition, though. We totally promise nothing will happen to them, Nick mocked. Do you honestly believe Julian would buy that? No, I don't, Carl shouted. He wouldn't believe that, nobody would. That's exactly why I'm not planning anything like that. Solace voluntarily took a huge risk bringing you on this expedition. If anything happens, we're the prime suspects. Even if we planned to kill you, we wouldn't do it during this expedition. Angering someone like Julian would be suicide. Killing you would be risking Solace's survival. Nick looked at him, still suspicious. Listen, Nick, Carl said, his tone calming. I genuinely didn't know what happened. See it from my perspective, I'm buried in the ground listening to Mark beg for his life. Then a couple of explosions and I'm terrified for my own survival. Then I hear them or it take Mark away. I don't know if it's still out there. I'm just waiting. Finally, I hear Irwin's voice come out and moments later, you come out too. How does that look from my side? The weakest member of our team survives an encounter with something even our strongest would be helpless against. What's more believable, that Mark told them exactly where you were, and you somehow still hid from them, or that he gave them the wrong location and kept all of us safe. Nick kept looking at him, skeptical. You said there's no evidence, he said. Because I thought you made it up, Carl said quickly. I thought you were trying to gain something from Solace. Annoyance crossed Nick's face. There's a time and place for manipulation and for sincere cooperation. When dealing with a partner that severely outclasses you in power, manipulation is the wrong approach. I know Hera and Ramona are more experienced than me. Trying to manipulate them would be stupid. And even if I wanted to, I wouldn't do it spontaneously by accusing one of their employees after something unforeseen happened. See, Carl said. That's very similar to what I said. I said it'd be idiotic to kill you, and you said it'd be idiotic to falsely accuse someone. But we both believed the other one did just that. Carl took a deep breath and sighed. That only means we each thought the other was an idiot. Nick didn't move, just looked at him. We don't plan on killing you, okay? Carl said. Look, I'll prove it. He turned around, showing Nick his back. See, we don't want to kill you. Turning my back to you is risky, but I trust you won't attack. Nick furrowed his brows. Carl had turned his back to him, and yet, why hadn't his ability activated? Nick quickly scanned the area. On top of one of the big boulders, he saw Irwin. Ding! A bright light flashed from Irwin's location. In his hand was a strange device. Nick recognized it, one of the things Solace sold to the public. A device that captured an image on a small piece of film, which could be enlarged onto paper. A camera. Nick realized what this looked like, Carl showing his back with Nick's blade readied. Didn't that look exactly like an assassination attempt? The next instant, Irwin pulled out his rifle and aimed it straight at Nick. At the same time, an earthen shield appeared around Carl. Boom! Irwin's rifle fired at Nick. Chapter 409, Emotions Running High. Whoom! An explosion of light appeared the instant the gun fired. Boom! The bullet hit something solid and stopped. The light vanished, revealing a huge earthen shield with a hole punched partway through, but not all the way. The shield crumbled away, revealing Carl, his face twisted with rage. He turned on Irwin, barely containing his fury. Irwin looked back in annoyance. You let him escape. Nick was nowhere to be seen. Bang! Carl jumped at Irwin with all his power. Irwin noticed and jumped back. Carl was an initial expert, Irwin a peak veteran, only one level between them, though a large one. Stop, Irwin shouted. I got the evidence, I took a photo, he waved the camera. Carl jumped after him with rage. This is the best. Boom! A huge earthen shield burst from Carl's arm and rammed into Irwin's barrier with all his strength. Electricity crackled across the barrier as the spikes on the shield released some kind of gas on impact. Irwin's eyes widened as he was thrown into the distance, his whole body shaking from the impact despite his strength. He coughed. Bang! Carl caught up to him in the air, summoned another earthen shield, and hammered him into the ground. Boom! Irwin hit the ground and left a crater. Carl rushed in after him. Bang! Irwin's barrier fizzled and broke. His face went white, and he looked like he couldn't breathe. Carl frowned and dug into one of Irwin's pockets, retrieving a small disc, Irwin's barrier. Then he took Irwin's rifle. Finally, he put a hand on Irwin's chest and pushed some Zephyx into him. Irwin took a deep breath, life returning to his eyes. If a veteran or stronger ran out of Zephyx, their survival was uncertain. Zephosis was a cycle that needed Zephyx to turn prefix into more Zephyx. Without it, no more prefix could convert, and the entire body would stop working. Taking all the Zephyx from an extractor was akin to sealing a normal person's airway. Carl grabbed Irwin and jumped back to the boulder formation. Bang! He threw Irwin into the middle. I'm not sure if you're still here, but I can assure you I did not want to kill you, Nick, Carl shouted. Irwin worked on his own. Silence, no answer. Carl's mind churned with a mix of negative emotions. He genuinely hadn't thought Mark had told those things where Nick was. If he had, Nick would be dead. He'd assumed Nick wanted some kind of advantage over Solace by accusing one of their dead extractors. Yet Nick's reaction had been too extreme, too genuine. Carl had worked and talked with many people, and he was fairly certain that outburst had been real. So he tried to calm Nick down, but as soon as he stepped forward, Nick jumped back, reading the step as aggression, even accusing Carl of wanting to silence him. That thought was terrifying. Yes, Carl had fought other extractors and caught many Specters, but he'd killed fewer than 5 people in his life, and he still vividly remembered every one of them. One of the main reasons he'd wanted to become a veteran decades ago was so he didn't need to sleep anymore in his sleep. He met the people he'd killed, again and again. Those deaths had all been necessary, and he knew it. But killing Nick was definitely not necessary, and Carl would never want to kill anyone unless it was. Earlier, when he turned his back to Nick, he caught a flash of light from atop one of the rocks and looked over Irwin with his camera. Carl's world felt like it was breaking down. He'd rushed to defend Nick from the shot, then the flash of light, and Nick had vanished. Luckily, Carl remembered exactly where Nick had been and where the rifle was aimed. He made it in time and blocked the bullet. In that moment he'd felt terror, frustration, anger, hatred. Irwin had ruined everything. And yet, even hating him right now, Carl understood why he'd done it. Irwin, Carl, and Mark had been best friends for over a decade, together almost all the time, working, drinking, having fun. Mark was the only one of them with a wife and kids, and Irwin and Carl visited often. Mark's kids called them Uncle Irwin and Uncle Carl. So when Irwin heard Mark had died, he'd been distraught. And distraught people often deny reality or look for someone to blame, fear curdling into anger, then resentment. If nothing else had happened, Erwin probably wouldn't have acted on it. But seeing Nick with a weapon drawn was too good an opportunity. Normally, he wouldn't have done something like this without consulting the other two, but the moment was too good. So he took the photo. By then it was already too late. Nick had seen him take it. Erwin knew there was no turning back and tried to kill him. From an outsider's view, it might look planned. Carl assuming a vulnerable position, Erwin snapping a photo as proof, then killing Nick without fear of consequence. Sadly or luckily, that wasn't the truth. Chapter 410, Unsavable Situation. Carl waited. No answer. The only sound was Erwin's labored breathing as he looked at Carl with frustration, fear, and anger. You let him escape, Erwin said between breaths. Shut up, Carl shouted in rage. You tried to assassinate a member of the team. Erwin breathed hard for a couple of seconds. I did, he said, but he deserved it. He killed Mark. He did not kill Mark, Carl said sharply. Erwin didn't answer for several seconds. Maybe not, he said neutrally, but that doesn't matter now, does it? His breathing evened out as his body stabilized enough not to need it every second. Carl narrowed his eyes, but Erwin kept talking. He saw us, Erwin said from the ground. He thinks you were in on it. He escaped, and if he wasn't lying, he's a runner. We can't catch a runner with that head start. Carl gritted his teeth. He'll tell the city, Erwin said neutrally. He'll accuse us of trying to kill him. Doesn't matter if you wanted to kill him or protect him. In his eyes, you wanted him dead too. Our lives are over. Solace will abandon us. Then, under Carl's narrowed glare, Erwin reached into a pocket and pulled out the camera. But we still have this, he said with a small chuckle, sitting up. As long as we have this, he can't prosecute us. Instead, he'll look like the one who tried to kill you. We're in the same boat now. Carl glared at him and walked forward. Erwin didn't move, still low on Zephyx, and without his barrier or weapon, there was nothing he could do anyway. Carl grabbed the camera, turned, and Boom! Threw it into the distance. Erwin's eyes shot open in terror. Are you crazy? You've killed us. Carl turned back to him, disappointment etched on his face. Who are you? He asked. Are you really Erwin? Is the Erwin I know really such a psychopath, so weak-willed he has to kill an innocent man to cope with a tragedy? If Mark saw what you did, what would he think of you? Erwin gritted his teeth, his whole body shaking. Mark's last screams, the explosions Nick made, Nick facing Carl with weapons drawn, the camera in Erwin's hand, the shot he'd fired, Carl's counterattack, the camera flying into the distance. But most of all, Mark's face. Erwin turned away and buried his head in his hands, shaking, pressing his palms into his face. Carl just watched grim. Fuck man, Erwin said, voice shaking, leaning back, tears welled in his eyes as he looked up at the sun. I don't fucking know, I lost control. I'm sorry, okay? Carl's expression stayed neutral. He couldn't help pitying his friend, but this was entirely Erwin's doing. I'm sorry for pulling you into this, Erwin said. I was just so angry at him. I saw a chance to vent it and took it without thinking. I fucked up majorly. He put his head back in his hands. I'm sorry, I should be the one who gets killed for treason, not you. Carl took a deep breath, then pulled a small piece of paper and a pen from his pocket and handed them to Erwin. If you want to make things right, write down your confession. Erwin looked at the pen and paper with broken eyes, then gave a small chuckle. I guess that's the least I could do. He stood, walked to a rock, and spent the next minute writing. When he finished, he handed the confession and pen back to Carl, who wrapped the paper carefully around the pen. Whoosh! He threw that into the distance too, though not as far as the camera. Erwin looked at it confused. What? Take it, Carl said. What? Not you, Carl said. Nick. What? Erwin asked again in shock. If there's one thing I learned talking to Nick earlier, it's that he's not an idiot, Carl said. And that he's exceedingly good at hiding. Do you think he ran back to the city after everything that happened? He knows you took a picture. He knows he's in serious trouble as long as that picture exists. Running to the city would only postpone the death he thinks we're planning for him. There's only one way out of this for him. To kill you, a voice finished from the side. Carl and Erwin turned and saw Nick standing between two boulders. Silence. Nick held up a camera, the one Carl had thrown. Carl let out a deep breath of relief. He'd thought Nick would be there, but couldn't have been sure until he showed himself. Earlier, believing Nick an idiot had led to disaster. This time, Carl had chosen differently. If he hadn't, they'd have been fighting Nick within minutes, and there would have been no saving the situation. Erwin had already thought it unsavable. Carl believed otherwise and went all in. He'd bet correctly. Chapter 411, Disbelief. Nick opened the camera and took out a tiny roll of film. CRK. He crushed it in his hand and threw the camera to the ground, then walked to the side. After several seconds of silence, he picked up the pen and paper with Irwin's confession and read through it. It stated that Irwin had tried to kill Nick, and that neither Solace nor Carl were involved. Nick pocketed it and looked at Carl. For a while, the two just looked at each other. Is he actually different? That was the thought Nick had returned to several times over the last minute. When Irwin had taken the picture, Nick had immediately used his third ability to blind everyone, turning to mist as he fell. He knew Irwin was 2 levels above him and a sniper. Snipers had the most terrifying attacks of all extractors, and Nick was certain his barrier couldn't have blocked the shot. Mist was his only option. The shot would still have hit him, though. His only hope was that Irwin used a precision attack instead of an area one. Good snipers could release both. A precision attack focused as much power as possible onto a tiny point, maximizing penetration. An area attack was the opposite, like the one that had leveled the house in front of Nick after Envy's avatar triggered the alarm, courtesy of a specialist sniper high on the megastructure. A precision attack would have left only a small hole. Instead, the surrounding 30 meters had been erased. If Irwin had used an area attack, Nick would have died in his fog state. But there was no reason for him to. That would waste power. Against an extractor's barrier, a precision attack was the better tool. With a precision attack, a good part of Nick's mist would have been destroyed, leaving him badly weakened and injured but alive, able to hide, recover, and counterattack. But none of that happened. Nick never felt any attack hit him, only saw Carl standing between him and Irwin. He hadn't stopped to think it through at the time. He just moved through the dust clouds Carl's charge had kicked up, flowing into a crack between 2 boulders to hide, already planning his counterattack. Then he noticed Carl and Irwin fighting, and watched from hiding. When he saw the half-dead Irwin thrown into the middle of the formation, skepticism crept in. Was this some scheme to draw him out? But that made no sense. Carl had saved him. Why save him just to kill him through some convoluted plot? When Carl called for him to come out, Nick hesitated. All of this felt too strange. Over the years, he'd learned again and again that almost all humans cared only about gorging themselves on others' belongings until they nearly burst. The manufacturers turned ordinary lives into nightmares, and the government stayed complicit just to keep their own hands clean. Even Julian kept telling him the average human did more damage to humanity than the average Specter. Nick fully expected Carl to be no different. But then Carl threw the camera away. At first, Nick assumed it was some scheme to lure him out, even though logic said otherwise. It was just that hard for him to believe someone powerful wasn't an irredeemable monster. But holding the camera, seeing the film inside, forced him to believe it, and when Carl called out again, Nick came out. He's actually different, Nick thought, looking at him. He never wanted to kill me, and even with his own survival on the line, he followed his morals. Sure, he believed I was still there, but that wasn't a certainty. Nick had to wrestle hard with his view of humanity. He thought of Simon Francium and the Champion of Light. People like those two were the only reason humanity still existed. Still, most people only care about themselves and their immediate family, he thought. If that weren't true, Aegis wouldn't need to force everyone into committing their lives to humanity. But there are still good people, maybe not as rare as I thought. It almost didn't feel real, someone in this world willing to risk his own survival for his morals. Rare and strange enough that a hallucination seemed more likely than the truth. After a moment, Nick walked toward Carl, who looked at him with relief. Nick stopped a couple of steps away, blades still sheathed. This almost caused at least one good person to die, Nick said. But thanks to your efforts, that won't happen. Chapter 412, Shame. Nick, listen, I'm sorry for what I said earlier, Carl said. I did not mean to say. It's fine, Nick interjected. I get what you mean. You don't need to apologize. In fact, I should be the one apologizing. You were just asking what happened, and I immediately jumped to the conclusion that you wanted to bury this and silence me. He sighed. I nearly killed you over an unfounded speculation. We talked about this already, Carl said. We both made a mistake. 2 idiots, right? He added with a smile. 2 idiots, Nick repeated with a small smile of his own. The two of them fell silent. It was a relief to talk like this, but one matter still hadn't been dealt with. Nick looked at Irwin, who refused to meet his eyes, turned to the side so only the edge of one eye showed. Nick could tell what he was feeling, shame. But he wasn't sure of what kind. Was Erwin ashamed of what he'd done, or ashamed that he hadn't succeeded? If he had succeeded, would he regret it hours or days later? How closely was his mind tethered to his emotions? Someone could do something horrible in a fit of rage that they'd never do otherwise, but how they acted afterward differed from person to person. Some felt nothing, as long as there were no consequences. Others were appalled and disgusted by what they'd done, and for them, escaping consequence could feel worse than facing it. Some were riddled with enough guilt to end their own lives. Nick knew that guilt well. So what kind of person was Erwin? Would he have regretted it if he'd succeeded? Nick couldn't be sure. Was he a good man who'd made a mistake, or had his true nature just come to light? "Let's deal with this when we're back," Nick said, turning to Carl. "I don't think we can continue the excursion." Carl sighed. He hated Erwin for what he'd done but still felt for him. If Nick had wanted to forgive him, he'd have said so by now, and Carl couldn't fault him for not. Erwin had tried to kill him. That was about as unforgivable as it got. "Of course," Carl said. "Nick, walk behind me." Then to Erwin, "You walk in front of me, please." Erwin sighed and nodded. "Go," Carl said. Erwin ran west, Carl behind him, Nick behind Carl. They reached the tunnel, ran through it, and came out the other side, continuing west. Whatever Nick had seen should have moved on by now, sure enough. The next few minutes passed without incident. Eventually, they reached the lifeless stretch north of the city and walked around it counterclockwise, passing the carbon fields and their guards. After a few words with the guards, they passed through green bushes with no fruit or flowers, just leaves and brown bark, and soon reached the southern entrance. They greeted the guards and entered the tunnel. "Any Specters?" the two experts guarding the bridge asked. "No," Carl said. One nodded and waved them through. Moments later, they were back in the city. It was almost shocking how short the excursion had been, barely an hour from leaving to returning. Yet so much had happened in that hour. "Nick," Carl said, looking at him, "I'm taking Erwin to Solace to tell Hera and Marion what happened. If you have time, come tell us what you saw. You still haven't told us what was hunting us." "Sure," Nick said. Erwin shot him a glance, gritted his teeth like he wanted to say something, then looked away again. Carl took a deep breath, put a hand on Erwin's shoulder, and guided him toward the inner city, leaving Nick behind in the outer city. For a while, Nick didn't move. Then he jumped to the side and traveled rooftop to rooftop until he reached a familiar house he hadn't visited in a long time. The last place he'd been thinking about what to do with Wintour, right before Julian showed up. For a while, he just looked at the red curtain of mist. Erwin had tried to kill him. He deserved to die. And yet, looking at the curtain, an image rose in his mind of himself, overlapping with Erwin. Nick saw a lot of himself in Erwin. He'd done plenty he regretted and still carried guilt he couldn't describe. Wasn't the whole reason he was doing any of this to redeem himself? Wasn't he searching for forgiveness? He thought about Erwin, then about himself. But do I even deserve forgiveness? Chapter 413, Erwin's Fate. 4 people sat in a meeting room, the atmosphere heavy and tense. Erwin sat with his eyes fixed on the table, wet with tears. Carl looked seriously at the 2 people across the table. Ramona Eliam rubbed the bridge of her nose. Hera Marion stared at the table in deep thought. "Silence." "What do we do now?" Carl asked. Ramona sighed. "It's not up to us." "It's up to Nick," Hera said without looking up. "What we do doesn't matter. He was the victim. Whatever he wants to happen will happen. The best we can hope for is that he won't fault Solace." "I don't think he will," Carl said. "I spoke to him. He seemed like a genuine guy." Hera didn't seem certain. "I thought so too a couple of years ago, but I'm not sure that's still accurate. He's changed a lot. He used to be really nice, almost naive, but he hasn't been like that in years." "Knock, knock, knock." "Come in," Ramona called. The door opened and the receptionist peeked through. Erwin didn't react. He knew this was probably his fate knocking, and he just didn't care anymore. "Miss, the chief Zephyx Extractor of Dark Dream wants to talk to you," the receptionist said. Almost everyone in the room took a deep breath. "Bring him here," Ramona said neutrally. "Of course, miss." The door closed again. "Well, at least we don't have to wait much longer," Hera said, leaning back. Carl looked at Erwin. His fists were clenched, gaze fixed on the table. He hadn't said a word since they'd returned. The 4 of them waited in silence. "Knock, knock, knock." The tension in the room thickened. Ramona and Hera took deep breaths. "Come in," Ramona called. The door opened fully, and the receptionist gestured the visitor in, Nick. He walked in wordlessly, expression neutral. The door closed behind him. Hera stood. "Nick," she said carefully. "It's fine," Nick said, waving her off. "I do not fault Solace. Carl did everything he could to help me, and as leader of the excursion he represented Solace. As far as I'm concerned, Solace did its absolute best to protect me." Ramona sighed in relief. Hera smiled with relief of her own. "Thank you. Still, one of our extractors did something horrible, and we owe you an apology." "If it makes you feel better, sure, I'll accept it," Nick said. Hera smiled. Nick nodded to Ramona, who returned it, then gave Carl a quick smile, which Carl returned weakly. Finally, he looked at Erwin with distant, dismissive eyes. Erwin didn't dare look back. "Erwin, look at me," Nick said. Erwin's body shook, and he turned his head away. "You tried to kill me, and now you won't even do me the small favor of looking at me?" Nick asked neutrally. Erwin tensed, then slowly turned to meet Nick's eyes. "Do you regret what you've done?" Nick asked. Erwin's eyes dropped to the table. "Look at me." Erwin looked up. "Yes," he said softly. "Do you feel guilty?" Erwin sighed and nodded. "Are there other things you regret, things you'd change if you could?" Erwin's eyes fell to the table again, and this time Nick let him stay there. A few seconds of silence passed. "I don't know," Erwin said. "I looked at some of my past mistakes positively since they brought me to where I am today, but now I don't like where I am, so maybe I should have regretted some of them more." It was obvious he was being honest. The easy move would have been to say yes and list a few minor sins to look sympathetic. Instead, he said he didn't know. People thrown into situations they'd never faced before often didn't know how to evaluate themselves. "You regret your current situation, not what you put others in," Nick asked coldly. "What does it matter?" Erwin asked. Silence. Nick studied him. Erwin hadn't looked back up since, a rebellious look on his face, like a teenager caught misbehaving. Thanks to Julian's lessons, Nick could guess what was going on. People often didn't act according to their true feelings. Nick took out Erwin's written confession. "You're not like me," he said. "Crrr." He tore it apart, stacked the pieces, tore them again, repeating it until only scraps remained. The other three stared, wide-eyed. Erwin didn't look up, but his body shook. Nick let the pieces fall to the ground. "Carl is someone I've learned to admire, and he believes you're a good person," Nick said. "Today is the closest you've ever come to death, and it's entirely your own fault. If you died today, it would be on you. Your past brought you here. Take this as a wake-up call. This is the last chance you get. Change or die." He looked around the room and nodded. "We'll talk another day." Then he walked out. Chapter 414, Erwin. The room sat in stunned silence. None of them had expected Nick to forgive Erwin, and rightly so. In the past, anyone who crossed Nick got retaliation. This time he didn't. Why? Several reasons. Before arriving, Nick hadn't been fully decided. He leaned toward letting Erwin go, but wasn't certain, so he'd needed to talk to him, watch him. Erwin's refusal to meet his eyes spoke of deep shame. But what kind? Shame at having done something horrible, or shame at being confronted with his biggest mistake? Did he resent Nick? A little, Nick could tell, resentment at having failed. But Nick knew people well by now. Someone with their back against the wall, unable to fight back, was often thought to reveal their true self. That was partly true, but not entirely. Erwin hadn't tried to paint himself favorably. If anything, he'd been dishonest in the other direction, overly harsh, presenting himself as uncaring. Was he truly uncaring? Most likely not. He and Carl had been close friends with Mark, close enough that Erwin lost control entirely at his death. That showed he could feel deeply for others. A cold, cruel person would have recognized attacking Nick as stupid. Instead, grief overwhelmed him. And when he'd said it didn't matter what others thought, did he mean it? In his own mind, yes, but he was wrong. In highly emotional situations, humans were terrible judges of their own feelings. So why paint himself so badly? He wanted to be punished. He didn't think he deserved forgiveness, though not consciously. He just believed he was a cold bastard and acted the part. Erwin wasn't a saint. He was just like everyone else. Of course, Nick couldn't be fully certain. Reading people always carried uncertainty. Get one thing wrong, and the whole picture could flip. It was possible Erwin really was cold and scheming underneath. That uncertainty was why Nick hadn't decided outright and was still unsure now. But he was fine with that. Uncertainty now could resolve with time, and there'd still be room to act later. Nick returned to Dark Dream and told Julian everything. When Julian heard how he'd handled Erwin, he chuckled. "I'm surprised," he said with a sinister grin. "Didn't think you had that kind of rational decision in you, if it works out." Nick didn't respond. He knew his choice might benefit Dark Dream, but that wasn't why he'd made it. "As for these red people, I think we can get some good money out of that," Julian said, smiling toothily. "Nobody knows why the North Zone is forbidden, and that knowledge is worth quite a bit." Nick didn't answer that either, and eventually left for work. Over the next few days, things happened. Erwin was fired. Solace couldn't keep him on and maintain a good relationship with Dark Dream. Then Carl and the rest of Solace cut contact with him entirely. Carl couldn't forget the way Erwin had smiled while shooting at Nick. That wasn't the man he'd thought Erwin was. The others severed ties on Solace's orders, without explanation, stating the reason would count as concealing a crime if it reached the city. Erwin lost every friend and contact in a single day. And he didn't care, it didn't matter. For days he wandered aimlessly, sometimes staring at the red curtain, sometimes at the megastructure, sometimes just at the ground. He wasn't sure what he felt, but for the first time he wished he could sleep. Sleep had always felt like wasted time. Now it felt like the best use of it. He just didn't want to exist like this anymore. Everything was shit, and most of all, he felt like shit. For several days he cared about nothing. Then it got worse. His mental state deteriorated. He didn't need to eat, drink, or sleep, which meant he didn't need to earn or spend money either. He could just exist perpetually doing nothing, and that was the worst part. No goal, nothing required of him, just existing feeling like shit. Lost. He didn't even try to find work. He didn't want to do anything. Eventually he hit bottom. He came close to speaking the sentence. But he couldn't do it. He couldn't throw his life away. The choice had been simple: die or keep living. He chose to keep living. And the first thing he did afterward was as unexpected as it was inevitable. He went to Dark Dream and asked to see Nick. Chapter 415, Many Ways. Nick looked at Erwin with a neutral expression, seated behind his desk while Erwin stood by the office door, worry, fear, and desperation written across his face. For the first time, Nick didn't need to tell him to look up. "I want to redeem myself," Erwin said, repeating himself. Nick didn't answer. "Apologizing would make light of what I've done," Erwin said, his voice shaking. "I don't ask for an apology and I don't ask to be forgiven. You might never forgive me, but I still want to try." He was nearly shouting by the end. Nick stayed silent for 5 seconds. "Why?" he asked neutrally. The single word seemed to intimidate Erwin. In front of Nick, he couldn't muster any strength, like a child begging on their knees. "I can't live with this guilt," Erwin said, then took a breath. "And I can't die either." Nick was quiet for a couple of seconds. "So you want to feel better. You don't care what I feel," he said evenly. Erwin's body shook. "No, that's not true. I want to make things right. I want to do everything in my power to pay you back." Nick let a few seconds pass. "Because your feelings drive you to make things right," he said. Erwin couldn't answer right away. He wanted to rebuke Nick immediately. In his own mind, he was genuinely trying to redeem himself by helping others, but in front of Nick, he couldn't find the nerve to talk back. The room fell silent. This was exactly the situation that had made Julian laugh. There were a few ways things could have unfolded after Nick let Erwin go. In every version, Solace would fire him. They couldn't keep him on and preserve their relationship with Dark Dream. And once a manufacturer fired a peak veteran, the reason alone would keep every other manufacturer from hiring him. Everything after that depended on Erwin. If he'd felt no guilt, he'd have gone looking for new companions and opportunities. Training, networking, maybe a city job, maybe love, maybe a business of his own. If any of that happened, Nick would have had his answer and could have killed him himself had Julian do it or told the city. His life would simply end, no more what-ifs. The same held if Erwin had chosen to dedicate himself to revenge. What he'd done gave Nick total power over his life, killable without consequence, the confession irrelevant since it was never needed. And if he actually felt guilt, that could go a few ways too. He might kill himself as his life fell apart. He might recover and live with the guilt for the rest of his days, or he might try to shed it, which would bring him to Dark Dream. If Nick had told the city outright, Erwin would have been executed. If he hadn't, Erwin would either end up executed anyway or become one of Dark Dream's most loyal, powerful extractors. Someone like him would likely never betray them. Julian knew all of this, which was why he'd laughed. Nick knew it too, but that wasn't why he'd made his choice. Mostly, he'd wanted to see how someone else handled this. Erwin, filled with guilt over something horrible he'd done. Wasn't that just like Nick? He wanted to see what someone else would do with it. When Nick had told Erwin he wasn't like him, he'd meant something specific. Erwin hadn't done something unforgivable. He'd attempted to kill someone bad, yes, but failed. And Nick wasn't an innocent child either. He was responsible for over 1,000 deaths of innocent people. His own guilt outweighed Erwin's by an enormous margin. So Nick wanted to give him a chance. Maybe he could make things right. And if Erwin actually succeeded, maybe Nick could too. There is nothing wrong with that, Nick said after 10 seconds of silence. We humans are inherently selfish. We help others because we want to be repaid. We help others because we want to be seen as good. We help others because we want to feel good about ourselves. In every case, helping others is very often helping ourselves. We get something out of it almost every time. True selflessness doesn't exist. And yet helping someone is still considered better than killing them unless they're a monster. So there's a gradient. Since true selflessness can't exist, humans can never reach the good end of it. So we move the goalpost. In that sense, the best person is someone who helps others without expecting repayment. That's as selfless and good as it gets. They still get satisfaction out of it, but that can't be helped. It's the best anyone can be. You want to get rid of your guilt. That's why you're here. Are you a good person? Nick chuckled, looking at the table. You tried to kill me. Of course you're not a good person. Erwin just looked at him in silence. But I see that you're trying. And while I haven't forgiven you, I'm willing to give you the chance to try. Then Nick took out a prepared contract, Erwin's information already filled in. Chapter 416, Welcome to Dark Dream. Nick had prepared the contract in advance on purpose, to intimidate Erwin. Erwin realized as much. Nick had expected him to come, asking for forgiveness. Being loyal out of guilt didn't necessarily mean seeing Nick as superior, so Nick wanted to break that down. Feeling predictable meant feeling vulnerable. Humans valued their free will, the sense of freedom and choice, and once someone could predict your every move, that sense of power vanished. The way Nick spoke had already shaken Erwin's confidence. Once confidence broke completely, people accepted almost anything at face value. Given the sheer power imbalance, Erwin took everything Nick said as truth, feeling small and vulnerable in front of him. Erwin took the contract with slow, careful hands, afraid of any sudden movement. Nick watched him with neutral eyes. Erwin was sweating under the pressure. He was 2 levels above Nick, yet felt like a child facing an intimidating stranger in a lonely alley. He read through it, feeling guilty just for taking the time. His instincts told him he should sign immediately, that reading it was disrespectful. You don't need to hurry, Nick said, startling him. Take your time. Thanks, Erwin said, returning to the page. The more he read, the more shocked he became. This contract was too good. Sure, he'd have no authority, but the pay was absurd, 10% of what he earned for Dark Dream, more than double what he'd made at Solace. By the time he finished, he felt guiltier than before. This felt more like a reward than a punishment. His hand shook as he signed and handed it back. Nick signed as well and stood. Follow me. Why, yes, sir, Erwin said, shooting to his feet. Everyone calls me boss. Sure, be boss. Nick led him to another office and walked in without knocking. Erwin followed, then looked away in guilt at the sight of who was inside. My, Erwin, you made quite a blunder, didn't you? Julian said with a chuckle. I'm sorry, Erwin said, not looking at him. He felt deeply guilty in front of Julian. He'd nearly killed his most important employee. It's fine, Julian said, laughing. Sit down. Nick already told me everything. Erwin sat in the chair across from Julian's desk, Nick standing diagonally behind him, which only made him more nervous. Julian smiled. Now you don't need to be so nervous. You're part of Dark Dream now. He casually signed the contract and handed Erwin a copy. Nick handles all personnel matters for the Extractors, Julian said. He decides who's hired and who's fired. I trust him with that, and I put my stamp on whatever he brings me. Our friendship is not the reason you're here right now. Erwin took a nervous breath and nodded. Good that you understand, Julian said, smiling. Welcome to Dark Dream. Thanks. Erwin understood the message clearly. Nick held all the power over his fate, and crossing him again would be the worst possible move. Julian nodded. If you need anything, tell Nick. Of course, Erwin said, standing. He knew he'd just been politely dismissed. Nick opened the door and they walked out. Afterward, he handed Erwin his uniform and equipment. Come back tomorrow, 8 a.m., I'll show you around. Given your level, I won't put you on a team, you'll work directly under me, but your position isn't superior to anyone else's. You don't need to take orders from team leaders, but they're my most trusted employees, and I'll believe them over you if there's ever a dispute. Understand? Erwin nodded twice. Yes, boss. Nick nodded back slowly. See you tomorrow, he said, heading to his office. Thank you, boss. See you tomorrow, Erwin said nervously. Left alone in the hallway, Erwin looked around. He now worked for Dark Dream. It didn't feel real, especially since the past few weeks had felt like a dark dream all their own. Maybe this had always been where he was meant to end up. He turned and left the building, unsure what to do with himself until morning. Just like that, Dark Dream had gained a peak veteran. As a powerful mid-veteran, Nick's strength had always towered over every other employee, a problem, since nobody had been strong enough to truly support him. Now they finally had someone, a powerful sniper and sensor, one who'd been on hundreds of excursions into the outside world. Hiring Erwin meant Dark Dream had gained an extremely valuable map of the outside world. Maybe that was worth even more than catching a Specter. Chapter 417, Mission. Nick leaned against the big gray cliff and took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them with conviction and climbed silently upward. At the top, he slowly raised his head over the edge. There it was, the endless sea. He was at the same spot from about a month ago, on the excursion with Carl, Erwin, and Mark. As his head cleared the edge, his ability deactivated just as expected, yet nothing moved. Something had noticed him, it just gave no sign of it. He raised and lowered his head over the edge repeatedly, every time his ability deactivated. This makes it official. Whatever's watching me is inside the sea, Nick thought. He studied the water for a while. It was hard to see anything in that depth and darkness, but he still felt movement. He waited. No one else was near the sea, no extractors, no specters, just Nick and the water. After about 30 seconds, the stick appeared again in the distance, growing just like before. But this time he knew what he was looking at, a mast, the top of a sail, a ship. When Nick had described it to Julian, Julian had confirmed it must have been a ship. Nick knew the world was round, but he'd never actually seen one before. The moment he spotted it, he knew the enemy was coming. Nick jumped down from the cliff and landed. Boom! Already exploding southwest. Running full power with his ability active, he covered over a kilometer in barely 5 seconds. The air grew thicker and thicker around him, like resistance building up ahead. Whoom! His Zephyx pulsed and the resistance vanished. Past the expert stage, extractors could brush supersonic speeds. Without care, that meant a sonic boom damaging property and deafening bystanders. If every powerful extractor boomed through the city, living there would be unbearable, so they learned to punch a hole in the sound barrier with their Zephyx, moving in near silence as sound flowed around them. It took a solid grasp of Zephyx manipulation, but anyone who'd reached this level mastered it quickly. 10 seconds later, Nick had covered over 3 kilometers southwest. Then his ability deactivated and his speed collapsed. He spun northeast and spotted 2 tiny dots, impossibly far away. He couldn't make out details, but he knew exactly what they were. He grabbed something from his belt and crushed it in his hand. Woo-um! A gigantic burst of red mist exploded outward, coating everything around him in a thick layer of red Zephyx, all within 2 seconds. In those same 2 seconds, the 2 distant dots had already grown to a terrifying size. Nick could see them clearly now, 2 figures wrapped in red coral, half their bodies encrusted, the other half looking like corpses left floating for days. In 2 seconds, they'd closed 4 kilometers. They jumped off the ship roughly 5 kilometers offshore, meaning they'd started about 8 kilometers from Nick, and halved that distance in 2 seconds. 2 kilometers per second, speeds only specialists and fanatics could reach. Nick's heart hammered as he kept running, though his own speed had collapsed, now over 10 seconds per kilometer. Another second passed. The coral pair closed to just over 2 kilometers. 1 more second and they'd reach him. Nick gritted his teeth. Every instinct screamed at him to activate his ability and vanish, but he forced himself to resist, watching them close the gap fast. Bang! The 2 coral figures suddenly halted midair with a punch forward, a violent explosion of wind rippling out. Bang! Another explosion, and they shot north again. Whoom! A bright ray of light streaked past Nick at incomprehensible speed, overtaking him and the 2 coral figures in under a second. Boom! An explosion of light erupted between the pair and the sea, and a blonde woman in Blitz's uniform appeared in its place, Arya Light, Blitz's chief Zephyx Extractor. But she wasn't alone. See, rah. A comet of violent fire trailed the beam and reached the two coral figures in an instant, consuming one, then the other. Bang! The fire vanished, revealing three people, the two coral figures bound in white chains held by the governor. Nick took a deep breath and sighed. Mission success. Chapter 418, Coral People. A moment later, Arya and the governor turned back toward the city, unwilling to linger near the northern sea. Even a hero had vanished there. Close your eyes, Arya said, appearing beside Nick instantly. He did and felt himself pulled into the sky, Arya carrying him back toward Crimson City. About a month earlier, Julian had begun negotiations with the governor over the information Nick had gathered on his excursion. Nobody knew why the North was so dangerous, and Julian was sure that knowledge was worth a lot. As soon as negotiations started, the city's own efforts to uncover the danger intensified. After all, if a small manufacturer like Dark Dream could find something out, surely the city could too. So they sent more people to investigate the shore. They found nothing useful, except that 3 researchers mysteriously vanished after investigating the sea at different points. The governor was furious. How did a minor manufacturer keep stumbling onto information like this? He debated joining the research himself, but decided against it, too risky. He'd already lost an expert and 2 veterans. Better to just pay Dark Dream and skip the risk. So Dark Dream told him what Nick had seen. Hearing about the coral people, the governor already had a theory, minions of a strong Specter. He tried using people as bait to catch some. It didn't work. Anyone who went to the northeastern shore was fine. Anyone who went north simply vanished. He lost 2 more veterans that way and complained to Dark Dream, was any of this even true? There was no way to verify it. Eventually Nick made an offer. Let me lure them out, I did it before, maybe it'll work again. The governor accepted and explained his plan, which Nick promptly overrode, insisting on doing it his own way. The governor was annoyed but eventually relented. Nick had him stay far enough away to be unsensible, promising to signal when it was time to move in. He also demanded a second hero join the mission. The Forbidden Zone had already claimed one, and he wanted backup. Blitz volunteered immediately. If there really was a Specter up north, catching it first could be a huge win. And that's how it played out. The mission succeeded. You can open your eyes again, Arya said. Nick did, finding himself on a small balcony high on the megastructure, just outside the entrance to the upper layer. The city below wasn't visible anymore, blocked by the wall raised because of the Crimson Sea. This was the same balcony from which that specialist had once destroyed Envy's greater relay. Good work, Arya said, smiling. Thanks, Nick said with a nod. Unlike Vernon, Arya didn't seem to view Dark Dream as an enemy, though not quite an ally either. Thanks for helping us catch these 2. Blitz will remember the favor, she said, smiling as she jumped and flew back out, up the side of the megastructure and through a small entrance near its peak, the same place the governor had taken the 2 coral people. Nick jumped onto the SHWEB railway and rode it down, reaching Dark Dream within a minute. Naturally, Dark Dream hadn't been part of the actual investigation. The governor wasn't sharing what they'd found. The city had paid for the information and could do with it as they pleased, keep it or not. Maybe it was the governor's small revenge for everyone the city had lost. That didn't stop Dark Dream from getting the information days later anyway. Arya Light had been part of the investigation, and Arya belonged to Blitz. She told the other major shareholders so Blitz could decide what to do. One of those shareholders was Vernon Melfian, who happened to be close friends with Julian. Vernon hated Nick, but not Julian. After some back and forth, Vernon told Julian on the condition that Nick never find out. So anyway, Julian said with a smile, turns out the coral people are people who went missing a long time ago. Nick showed little reaction. I figured that's what was going on. Julian chuckled. Just as expected, the corals are controlling them. What's surprising is that they're still alive, not reanimated corpses. They never died. From what they found, the corals enter the nervous system near the neck and take full control. The brain's untouched, but the corals release a paralyzing agent that dissolves every nerve outside it, even in the face. If the city removed the corals, their zephosis would end, and they'd die the moment their Zephyx storage ran dry. So the coral people only have 2 choices, obey the Specter or die. Julian chuckled again, although I don't think they really have a choice. Chapter 419, Servant. Do we know how strong the Specter is? Nick asked. Definitely at least a demon, Julian said, smirking. Could be a fallen, but we know something the city doesn't. Nick nodded. It can't be a powerful fallen. Almost certainly within the first 3 levels, most likely it just became a fallen recently. Julian chuckled. How could Dark Dream figure out the Specter's power when the city in Kugelblitz couldn't? One reason, it had gone after Nick. Twice. For decades, the Specter to the north had never shown its hand. Whenever someone vanished, it took them unnoticed, which meant it wasn't stupid. Quite the opposite, supremely intelligent, invisible when it wanted to be, inescapable when it wanted to be. It had only ever struck when certain its prey was alone. The first time it sent the Coral people after Nick, that might still have held a specialist against a couple of veterans, and an expert were decent odds. But a few things didn't add up. Why interrogate the captured mark at all? The person the Specter had actually sensed had already escaped chasing that lead risked exposing them. If they'd simply taken Mark, nobody would have learned what they looked like, and they'd have quietly claimed another victim. Instead, they interrogated him and jumped southwest, hunting the person the Specter had sensed. Why? And when the city later tried to find the Coral people, they went back to their old pattern, only taking the lone and weak. But the moment they found Nick again, they charged kilometers inland onto the shore. Did they normally travel that far to catch someone? No, the city would have caught on by now. Yet for Nick, they did exactly that. It was almost like they desperately wanted him specifically. But why would they? Nick was just a random veteran. Unless, wasn't there a Specter already very interested in capturing him? Envy? Julian had told Nick before about Envy's servant, the prison, and how Julian had thrown it out of the city. The prison had been sent to catch Nick, but couldn't get past Julian, so it sent one of its own servants instead, the one that infiltrated the Spartans as a wish-granting possession Specter and used them to hunt Nick. Then the Crimson Sea broke out and consumed it, and the entire city vanished under red mist. From the outside, that looked like the city had been destroyed. The prison saw the mist and assumed Nick was dead and gave up. But years later, Envy learned that Crimson City had somehow survived. With the prison having failed once, Envy turned to another Specter, most likely the one in the Northern Sea, either already one of its servants or recently made one, tasked with capturing Nick on sight. That was how Nick and Julian knew the Northern Specter couldn't be a powerful fallen, only a weak one at most. A Specter needed considerably more power to enslave another Specter remotely without being physically present. Simon Francium had said Envy was being detained far away, so it couldn't simply appear here, and something of similar power wouldn't bow to Envy on command. But if Envy had servants near that power level, that changed things. Envy kept a few weak fallen as servants. If a weak fallen or demon disrespected it, one of those servants might show up to deal with them. The city, of course, knew none of this. As far as they were concerned, Nick was just unusually good at luring out the Coral people. Why would such a powerful Specter care about such a weak extractor? But none of that matters, Julian said, chuckling. We got what we wanted. What did we get? Nick asked. One initial adult and 2 early adolescents, Julian answered. Nick's brows furrowed. Great, sure, but he needed a late or peak adult to actually grow stronger. An initial adult barely helped. We got the initial adult for the information, and the 2 early adolescents for catching the Coral people. The city will prepare them and deliver within 2 weeks. Sounds good, Nick said. He was careful not to seem too disappointed that the Specters weren't personally useful to him. Better to look like Dark Dream's interests came first, so Julian never suspected Nick already knew he'd eventually try to kill him. It wasn't all bad, anyway. Dark Dream needed more adolescents regardless. Their number of Johns was pitifully small next to Solace's 50+. More Johns meant more veterans down the line, and more veterans meant more adults captured. Chapter 420, The Blaze. A couple of days passed, and Nick eventually called for the government to deliver the 3 Specters Dark Dream had been promised. Transport went smoothly, and all 3 arrived within minutes. All right, 1 possession Specter and 2 physical Specters, Nick thought after the guards left. A bit disappointing that the adult is the possession Specter, since it can't grow anymore. Though that might be useful eventually, at some point we'll need ways to strengthen several veterans at once. Nick nodded to himself and headed to the 4th floor, home to the possession Specters. Adult possession Specters were rare. Not every manufacturer had one. Gemini, for instance, had none. Possession Specters were roughly as numerous as physical Specters, with 4 Specters the rarest of all, but the higher the level, the rarer possession Specters became, since they couldn't grow more powerful after forming. So how did adult possession Specters exist at all? They were born that way. No one in Crimson City had ever witnessed a Specter forming, but researchers had extrapolated a rough picture. Physical and force Specters simply appeared out of nowhere. As far as anyone could tell, perhaps prefix gathered in the air, compressed, and became something new. Possession Specters were different. The name implied it. They possessed something that already existed. Crimson City had poured research into how they formed, learning that could mean creating their own Specters, skipping the hunting and suppressing entirely. They still didn't know, but Ghosty's theory was the most credible. He'd already proposed that Specters existed to inflict suffering on humanity, and extended that logic here. Objects steeped in negative emotion were more likely to become Specters. A hammer that broke 20 arms had a far higher chance than one used for construction. Enough suffering, and the negative emotion pulled in prefix like a magnet. It was a good theory, but it didn't explain the power level a possession Specter ended up at. Durability meant nothing. The screaming coffin, a large, sturdy wooden box, was far weaker than the glasses, which were just glasses. All anyone could say for certain was that a possession Specter was born at whatever power it would ever have. The more powerful, the rarer and rarer by a consistent factor of 5. On average, for every 5 hatchlings, 1 adolescent. For every 5 adolescents, 1 adult. Dark Dream had only 4 possession Specters total, 1 adult, 2 adolescents. Good quality, low quantity. Solace had over 15. Ghosty's lab had over 70. Solace alone matched Dark Dream's entire collection. More possession Specters meant more Extractors Dark Dream could train and employ. But that's for the future, Nick thought. For now, let's check our newest addition. On the 4th floor, he approached one of the containment units to the east and walked in without hesitation, closing the door behind him. In the middle of the room stood a tall metal stick on a wide base, 2 metal bars spiraling up from its edges in a double helix, ornate and winding, before bending inward to merge with the central shaft about 150 centimeters up. From there, it extended another 20 centimeters, completely wreathed in crimson fire. Nick could feel the heat from where he stood. This was the blaze. He took a breath, stepped closer, gritted his teeth, and thrust his hand into the flame, gripping the fiery metal tight. The fire flared and his arm burned. He fought the instinct to yank it back, breathing hard through the pain. It hurt like hell. 8, 9, 10. He pulled his arm free and looked at it. His uniform was untouched, as if it had never been near the fire, but his hand was red, black, and sinewy, looking exactly as bad as it felt. If he hadn't already endured the nightmare's torture so many times, he'd be screaming. This was worse than the can. He walked to the wall and pressed a button. A drop of green liquid fell from a faucet onto his burned hand, vanishing instantly and restoring some strength. The hand still wasn't fully healed, but it no longer looked as bad. Doesn't hurt as much anymore, which matters most, Nick thought, examining it. With my recovery, it'll fully heal in a couple hours. He glanced at the faucet. 1 drop costs about 10,000 credits. Let's see how much the blaze actually produced. Chapter 421, Difficult Work. Nick left the containment unit and checked the Zephyx container. 84 grams, he thought. Subtract the cost of the recovery liquid, and that's about 74 grams of profit. The good part is there's no daily cap on production. According to the report, the blaze produces more Zephyx the more it burns. As a mid-veteran, my body holds far more Zephyx than a John's, which means it takes longer for the fire to burn through me, but it produces more in the process. A peak John can hold their hand in for 3 seconds at most before amputation becomes necessary. Though a peak John would still need a drop of recovery liquid, and that price doesn't move. And I can't just withhold it from them, that'd be barbaric. I need to test more. He left the 4th floor and returned 2 minutes later with a man of average height and black hair. "Oh, it's a possession Specter, boss," Taryn asked. Nick nodded and led him into the room. At the sight of the burning stick, Taryn took a deep breath, hoping he didn't need to do what he suspected he needed to do. "It gains power by burning Zephyx," Nick said. Taryn's heart rate spiked. "Yes, it hurts just as much as you imagine," Nick added. Taryn closed his eyes. "Will it increase my power?" Aside from Nick, Taryn was probably Dark Dream's most power-hungry employee, the one who'd kicked the can the most, until he grew too strong for it and his progress stalled. "It's an initial adult," Nick said, "basically like the can but more painful and stronger." A complicated mix of fear and excitement crossed Taryn's face, fear, but also relief at finally having a faster path to growth. "Okay," he said after a moment, "what do I do?" I'll show you, Nick said, approaching the blaze again. Taryn watched, breath held, as Nick thrust his other hand into the flame. The fire raged, and Nick gritted his teeth, though from Taryn's angle he barely reacted at all. Taryn couldn't tell if Nick had exaggerated the pain or was simply inhuman. 10 seconds later, Nick pulled his arm free and took a drop of recovery liquid. That's it, he said. Your body's weaker, so you can only hold 3 seconds 4 at the absolute max. After that, 1 drop of recovery liquid. Taryn nodded, understood. He approached the blaze, took a breath and thrust his arm in. Ah fuck, he yanked it out after barely a second. His arm was red, though not as black and sinewy as Nick's had been. Still, it hurt enough to break him out in a sweat. He bolted for the faucet. Bunk. Nick stepped between him and it. You were in there for barely a second. Use the faucet now and we break even. We want a profit, Nick said neutrally. Taryn stared at him in shock. You can leave now or put your hand back in for 2 more seconds, Nick said. Taryn gritted his teeth. This had hurt like absolute hell. He stared at his shaking arm, glanced at the door, at the blaze, at the door again, fists clenching. He wanted to keep going, but it hurt so fucking much. After a moment he approached again, arm extending slowly, wavering back and forth toward the fire, snapping back, forward, back. Fuck, he shouted and shoved his arm in, then yanked it straight back out. Fuck. He wanted to grow stronger, he just couldn't make himself do it. Why can't I fucking do this? This was exactly why the city had handed them this particular Specter. The blaze was brutally difficult to work with. Getting a hand in for a fleeting instant wasn't hard, keeping it there was. Burning pain ranked among the worst pains that existed. Extractors were employees, not slaves. A manufacturer couldn't force one to do something against their will, short of threatening their life outright, and even then, loyalty would suffer for it. Getting your hands burned as a day job wasn't something most people volunteered for. It took real conviction to work the blaze profitably. Taryn felt awful, especially remembering that Nick had held his arm in for a full 10 seconds while he couldn't manage 3. Fuck, he shouted. Boss, I can't count like this. Pull my arm out when the 3 seconds are up. Nick's eyebrows rose. Taryn turned back to the blaze with a mad glint in his eyes, breathing rapidly, sweat pouring down his body, eyes losing focus. Then he lunged forward and grabbed the burning metal with both hands. Alia. Chapter 422, The Bitch. Bang. Nick pulled the screaming Taryn away. Both arms were badly injured, but only the right matched the damage Nick's own arm had taken. Nick had pulled him out after 2 seconds on that one, since the left had already been in for a second longer. Any longer, and it might have been unsavable. He put both arms under the faucet and pressed the button. 1 drop came out, and Taryn rubbed it across both arms, which recovered almost completely within 3 seconds, left only a bit red. As a peak John, Taryn needed far less recovery liquid than Nick. 1 drop covered both arms. Taryn sighed in relief. His arms still hurt, but nothing like before. You can do that once per day per appendage, Nick said. Recovery liquid counts as foreign Zephyx. Use it too often on the same part of your body, and your control over your own Zephyx will permanently drop. Your body needs about 20 hours to fully assimilate it. Taryn looked at him surprised. I didn't know that. It's not common knowledge. Not many extractors need recovery liquid daily. Neither of them had seriously considered skipping it. The pain was crippling. Without it, they'd be paralyzed for hours. Taryn studied the blaze for a while. The first time was always the worst, and with it behind him, he wasn't as opposed to trying again. Once per day per appendage, he repeated, glancing at his legs, then shaking his head. Maybe tomorrow. I think I'll work with it from time to time, he said. Nick nodded. Boss, Taryn said. Yes. Could you help me again if I need it, like today? Sure. Thanks. The two left the containment unit, and Taryn went back to his job as one of Dark Dream's 2 team leaders. Nick lingered a bit longer, looking at the containment unit. The city hadn't shared the Blaze's backstory, but Julian knew it anyway through his connections. A bit over 25 years ago, people had regularly vanished and reappeared completely changed, barely speaking, flinching at loud noises, and notably terrified of fire. None of them remembered much, just fragments soaked in fear and suffering. Eventually the cause came out. The mistress, a fanatic who'd built a cult of normal people and a few extractors to abduct citizens on her behalf. She gained power from causing pain, and the abducted were tortured to satisfy her, kept alive only because killing them all would have drawn far too much attention from the government and other manufacturers. Kugelblitz eventually took care of her and her cult. She'd been contained within Kugelblitz ever since, under a new nickname, the Bitch. Working with her was no fun at all. 2 years after her capture, the city found the Blaze, an adult possession specter, rare and valuable. Its existence lent Ghosty's theory more weight. The burning stick had been a torch used to torture the mistress's victims, not yet a specter at the time. By his logic, the fear it accumulated surrounded it with negative energy, and few objects in Crimson City had caused that much suffering, hence its arrival as a full adult. At least that was the theory. It held up well. Maybe someone had been sealed in a coffin and dumped in the sewers, birthing the screaming coffin. Maybe the glasses had led some influential person into a string of terrible decisions. Maybe plenty of people got hurt kicking the can before it ever became a specter. The scale of suffering seemed to track with a possession specter's power, and the Blaze, having caused the most, was also the strongest. Maybe the spilling bottle was once used to poison someone, Nick thought. That would explain why it's so weak. He checked the Zephyx container again, curious how much Terran had produced. 49 grams for both arms. Minus the recovery liquid, that's about 39 grams profit. He took a breath. No wonder the city handed us this one. Frightening potential, but so hard to actually work with that its output undersells its power. If Terran and I both use both arms daily, that's about 220 grams a day, minus 30 for recovery liquid, 190 grams. Less than the Dreamer, an entire level below this thing. He closed the container. I doubt anyone else in Dark Dream has the will to work with it, just Terran and me then. Anyway, the other two Specters. Chapter 423, Bloodcat. Nick left the 4th floor for the 5th, home to the training Specters. One of the new early adolescents would be especially useful, not for newbies, and not really for leveling up an extractor, but for something else. He approached one of the Eastern containment units, put his hand on the door, and waited a moment. Bang, bang. He threw it open, stepped in, and shut it fast. Bang. A blood-red shadow shot past where he'd been standing and slammed into the door. Nick had expected it and sidestepped without concern. The Specter came at him again. He sidestepped again. Dodging an early adolescent wasn't hard for a mid-veteran. As he kept evading, he studied the newcomer, a skinless cat, no more than 30 centimeters tall, small but dangerous for its extreme speed. Faster than a typical early adolescent, Nick would place it somewhere between mid and late adolescent. This was the Blood Cat, another progeny of the Blood Ancestor, like the Blood Hawk and Blood Horse, not sapient, incapable of reasoning, driven only to attack whatever was closest. Bang! Nick kicked it, and its head exploded off its body. Bang! The head hit the wall and turned to paste, but the headless body kept lunging blindly, unable to sense him without it. About 5 seconds later, a new head grew in, restoring its senses, the same hyper-regeneration shared by all the Blood Specters. Working it was no different from the Hawk or Horse. Beat it up a few times, then leave. The one added wrinkle with the cat was its speed, abnormally fast, even for its kind. Blood Specters gained new abilities as they advanced. As hatchlings, the Hawk and Horse had only hyper-regeneration and nothing else unusual. But as an early adolescent, the cat had one extra trait. Fortunately, evolved abilities among Blood Specters were simple and always tied to physical stats, more strength, more defense, or more speed. As far as Nick knew, no Blood Specter besides the Ancestor itself had ever gained anything beyond those three. The cat had drawn speed. Bang! Nick kicked it into the wall, shattering bones and tearing exposed muscle across its body. Watching it recover, Nick decided he liked this one. Simple to work with, and it gave Extractors real combat experience, the kind that could save a life during a Specter breakout or an attack. Hawk made a good introduction, not overwhelmingly strong, and it attacked in straight, predictable lines. The Horse was a solid intermediate test, physically stronger than most Extractors fighting it, but not smart. The cat was ideal for experienced Extractors, fast enough to outpace them and relentless in pursuit. Anyone unprepared for its assault would find their barrier cracked and Zephyx drained fast. The trade-off was real danger. Without someone able to step in if things went bad, Dark Dream could lose an Extractor in that room. That was expected, though. Every manufacturer kept a few dangerous Specters that required supervision. Nick beat the cat down a few more times until its regeneration noticeably slowed, then left. About 7 fatal wounds, he thought, then checked the Zephyx container. About 30 grams, he thought with a sigh. Pitiful, but expected. Working the blood specters this way meant harvesting Zephyx off their regeneration rather than growing them stronger, which produced far less. It's for the new extractors, he thought. Though for now it's for the experienced ones too. They haven't had a real opponent yet. Maybe send the late Johns in alone, mid-Johns in pairs, early Johns in fours. I'll tell Jenny. Or transfer the weaker Johns into Taryn's team. He already runs training. He scratched his chin. But that unbalanced the teams badly, leaving him with 2/3 of everyone. He closed the small door to the Zephyx container and turned for the stairs. I'll sort it out later. For now, the last new Specter. Chapter 424, The Gambler. Nick left the 5th floor for the 2nd, home to the unremarkable physical Specters like the Money Sink and the Bleeding Lady, plus one new addition. He stopped in front of one of the Western containment units. Do I have enough on me? He thought, checking his pockets, then pulling out a stack of long metal plates, each worth 1,000 credits. Should be enough. Since this Specter came from the city, Nick already knew how to work with it. He opened the door and walked in at an unhurried pace, closing it behind him. Hello, hello, I presume you are a new customer. A tall man in a fancy suit and black top hat stood in the middle of the room, smiling charmingly beside a table of card decks. The table itself made of rare, jet black wood. This was one of Dark Dream's 3 new Specters, the Gambler. Nick walked over, met with a toothy grin. Hi, I'm the Chief Zephyx Extractor of Dark Dream, your new place of residence, he said. Oh, so I'm in Dark Dream now, the Gambler said, interested. I heard some of my previous customers mention this place. New manufacturer, right? Kind of. The Gambler was clearly sapient, quite intelligent in fact. Not a man of many words, I see, he said, pulling out a deck. Each card back showed a black void with 2 red eyes at its center. He shuffled casually. What are my new guidelines? Money only, or are we playing for keeps? Money, Nick said. Oh, that's sad, the Gambler lamented. Not interested in a real game. Win once and you could earn a full kilo of Zephyx. The rules and deck are fair, always a 50-50. Why not live a little? Nick eyed him, unamused. The document says it's more like 40-60. The Gambler laughed. That's because most people just aren't good at cards. With perfect strategy, it's 50% maybe better, since I'm not flawless myself. Not interested, Nick said. Someone I know well always says to minimize what you can't control and maximize what you can. Why would I risk the Zephyx in my body when I can grow it without meaningful risk? And I don't want any of my employees doing it either. Nobody gambles with their Zephyx here, even if they want to. If I hear otherwise, I'll quarantine this unit for a month. Understood. The Gambler kept shuffling inside. Of course, money only. Good. Nick set the stack of plates on the table. The Gambler's smile widened. All right, he said. Let's start simple, a game of chance. We each draw a card, higher card wins. 1,000 credits a bet, fine with you. Nick nodded. The Gambler pulled a plate from the stack, set it aside, cut the deck, and handed Nick half. Both drew. Nick's eyebrows rose at the image on his card. A big red slime in the middle of a containment unit, a 5 in the top right, the name across the top, the Blood Ancestor. Where'd you get this deck? Nick asked. Made it myself, the Gambler said. I build new cards from what I hear about the Specters in here. I can't see them directly, but I've heard enough to paint a pretty clear picture. Interesting, Nick said. And where'd you get the information? Don't you already know, Nick? Nick wasn't surprised the Gambler knew his name without being told, and yes, he knew exactly how. Information could be gambled too. Almost anything could, as long as the Gambler had the power to collect what was owed. He'd probably worked with someone from Ghosty's lab to piece the Blood Ancestor together. So what you get? The Gambler asked. Nick laid his card down. The Blood Ancestor. The Gambler laughed. Wow, luck is a cruel mistress. Nick didn't react outwardly, though he felt a small satisfaction. Who didn't winning a game? Then the Gambler set down his own card. Nick's eyes widened, a forest of huge red mushrooms riddled with bleeding holes, the floor a mass of vein-like roots, screaming faces on every cap. A 6 in the corner. The name, the Crimson Fungus. To lose with a fanatic, the Gambler said, chuckling as he collected the plate. Truly tragic. Chapter 425, Ratio. Nick wasn't sure it was really a coincidence. Drawing the strongest card immediately seemed unlikely. Is he trying to lure me into betting information? He wondered. Is this a trick? He asked. I can't break the rules or use any trick, the Gambler said. If I did, I couldn't produce Zephyx. It's just bad luck. And if you mean the card, it would have shown up eventually anyway. Just would have taken more rounds. Nick's suspicion eased, though it didn't vanish entirely. Let's continue, he said, setting out another plate. Certainly, the gambler said, sliding it aside. Same game. Same game. A bit boring, but sure. He pulled another card. Nick pulled his own and felt a flicker of shock at the image. The talker. For a moment he thought the gambler had somehow learned about the talker specifically, then remembered the talker had once worked with the city, which explained it easily enough. Nick laid his card down. The gambler laughed and set his own beside it, an old lady sitting on a blanket in a containment unit, a 2 in the corner, named the other old lady. Seems like you won, the gambler said. Another round. Nick left the plate where it sat. We're playing until the money's gone. A sharp eye might have noticed Nick never collected his winnings. Wasn't he owed 1,000 credits? Technically, yes, but taking it back would have been the wrong move. Instead, the gambler simply released a burst of Zephyx and kept the credits, and that Zephyx was worth more than the money anyway. The gambler produced Zephyx on every completed game, win or lose, the only difference being he released more when the Extractor won. They played 20 more rounds, and the win ratio stayed close to 50%, as expected. How about raising the bet this round? The gambler asked. No, Nick said immediately. Again, the gambler sighed. He'd asked 3 separate times, and every single time, Nick had won that round, meaning a higher bet would have paid out far more Zephyx. Why not make this more fun? Because you're better at this than me, Nick said. Anything that adds complexity only lowers my odds. 50% is the ceiling I can reach. That's not true, the gambler said. Some people have gotten more out of me than they put in. Individual cases, Nick said evenly. The average still favors you, otherwise you'd have gone bankrupt long ago. He set down the next card without even looking at it. The gambler studied him for a moment before his smile returned. Well then, I suppose we keep playing this game. They continued for over an hour, until Nick ran out of money. That's it, I presume, the gambler asked. Nick nodded. How much Zephyx have you gained? Working with a cooperative, intelligent Specter had its perks. You could just ask about their progress toward the next level. Nothing, the gambler said. At this rate, an hour a day, I'd advance in about 20 years. Nick didn't love hearing that, though he'd half expected it. I'll see what I can do, he said, heading for the exit. See you next time, the gambler called, waving. Outside, Nick checked the Zephyx produced. 66 grams in a bit over an hour, he thought, an insane rate for an early adolescent that could be worked constantly. He'd spent 50,000 credits, roughly 50 grams of Zephyx worth, leaving a profit of about 16 grams for that hour. Scaled up, that was roughly 300 grams a day, making the gambler Dark Dream's second most profitable Specter after the talker. But they were siphoning off nearly everything it produced, leaving it almost nothing to grow on. Squeezed like this, it would never advance, a waste of its potential. Nick wanted it to grow stronger so it could produce even more, and there were 2 ways to get there. Change the ratio the containment unit absorbed, or increase the odds of the Extractor losing. The more the Extractor won, the more Zephyx the unit kept, but the less the gambler retained for itself. He put the container away and went to the console, fiddled with it for a bit, and dropped the absorption ratio from 90% to 75%. Run constantly with an infinite money supply, that would net roughly 50 grams of actual profit a day, though the number would swing, since costs and revenue sat close together, leaving thin margins. Some days, Dark Dream might even lose money. But it was worth it. The more they lost now, the faster the gambler grew, and the stronger it became, the higher the Zephyx return on every future bet. Dark Dream was investing in him. Chapter 426, Useful Only on Paper. In the end, Nick assigned Jenny and a number of late Johns to the gambler. The reason was simple, the sheer volume of Zephyx it produced. When an Extractor worked a Specter, they absorbed based on revenue, not profit, which meant the gambler boosted an Extractor's strength dramatically in very little time. The catch was a daily cap on how much Zephyx anyone could absorb, which was exactly why Nick spread the work across so many people, nothing wasted. In a way, the gambler was the perfect Specter for lifting many Extractors at once. 9 people hit their daily cap working it, all late and peak Johns. As for the ability it granted, it fell under sensor abilities, though it wasn't much use to an actual sensor. It let someone feel when the odds of something were bad. That sounded incredible on paper. Dodge the wrong way in a fight, make perfect strategic calls, give flawless orders, so many possibilities, right? Sadly, anyone who thought that had no experience with how things actually worked. The feeling was subtle and grew weaker the less time there was to decide, and the more removed the outcome was from the person feeling it. Useless mid-fight. Useless when deciding for someone else. Useless for anything more than a couple of seconds out, like planning an assault. Amazing on paper. Useless in nearly every case with a real payoff. Not completely useless, though it worked as a faint warning before an attack, helped avoid saying the wrong thing, helped steer clear of dangerous places. People still claimed the ability's real potential lay further down the line, weak now, powerful later. Maybe, but anyone banking on that was mostly naive. Reaching that payoff took heavy investment, and this wasn't something a person could invest in alone. It needed someone else providing protection, money, resources. A huge manufacturer might take that bet. But then there was the other problem. All that investment rode on one person. After millions or billions of credits, that person might finally be ready to pay it back, and then simply get killed, and the whole investment vanished with them. Too risky in the end. Nick handed the ability to a handful of new employees, but had no plans to send them on excursions, strictly internal work. With that, the 3 new Specters were settled. Dark Dream now officially had 17. They'd grown a lot but were still far behind Solace and the other major manufacturers. Even doubling their Specter count wouldn't close the gap. Nick was still missing a late or peak adult. Without one, advancing past late veteran made no sense. Powerful adults were brutally hard to acquire, worth too much money for anyone to sell, no matter the price offered. Dark Dream had to earn them the hard way. Over the following months, Nick took Erwin on repeated secret excursions. Erwin showed him the wider wilderness, and Nick grew increasingly familiar with it. Going too far was still off the table. Other cities were the problem. Entering another city's territory meant near certain death, and even skirting the edges was dangerous, since anyone encountered there would be at least an expert. Nick and Erwin were confined to a roughly 70-kilometer radius. A large area, sure, but the senses of experts and specialists reached for kilometers, forcing them to move with extreme caution. Within 3 months, they managed to capture one Specter, sadly, a mid-hatchling possession Specter, a rust-covered hammer that gained power from bludgeoning people. Working it was miserable, its Zephyx output negligible, and it granted no abilities and couldn't grow. Still worth something as a Specter, but for now the rusty hammer just occupied a containment unit doing essentially nothing. Maybe they'd sell it eventually. Dark Dream remained in a rough spot, competing against far larger manufacturers without a comparable force, growing painfully slowly. Then 4 months after acquiring the Blaze, the Blood Cat, and the Gambler, an opportunity arrived. A very powerful, very unusual guest. "I wish to talk to your chief Zephyx Extractor," a tall man said, his voice neutral. "Oh, of course," the receptionist answered, shaky, forcing a smile. "I'll get him right now, Mr. Stairwell." Mundus Stairwell, Anatomy's chief Zephyx Extractor, simply nodded. Chapter 427, Mundus Stairwell. Nick approached Mundus with a neutral expression. "Welcome to Dark Dream," he said politely, offering his hand. Nick was nowhere near Mundus' level, but as host, good manners still mattered. Mundus shook it, looking him in the eye. "Thank you, I've come with a business proposition." "Glad to hear it," Nick said, gesturing toward the stairs. "Let's talk in my office." They walked to the extractor shafts. The door opened, and Nick jumped wall to wall up to the 8th floor while Mundus simply levitated below him. Proper flight only unlocked at the 6th level. Specialists had pseudo-flight tricks, like kicking off the air to jump in a direction, but it was slow and costly next to running. Heroes flew as fast in the air as on the ground and barely spent any Zephyx doing it. On the 8th floor, Julian was already waiting outside his office. Mundus showed no reaction at the sight of him, but Nick was nervous. This was a real risk. A longer conversation with Mundus in no hurry meant plenty of time to study Julian closely. If Mundus ever suspected he was a Specter, he'd be able to feel it. It was like having a spy inside a group. Signs that read as harmless quirks to the unsuspecting only clicked into place once suspicion existed. "Oh, that guy has long talks with his wife after big meetings. Sure, she's nosy. That guy got lucky dodging the ambush convoy. Just luck." Only real suspicion made the pattern visible, the same way people rarely spot a cheating partner until confronted with hard evidence, then feel like fools for missing all the obvious signs. Julian's Zephyx moved strangely, in a way that echoed how a Specter's did, though certain abilities could also cause that. Still, he had no choice but to sit through this meeting. Skipping it when a hero showed up would be far more suspicious. Everyone dropped what they were doing for a visit like this. Nick walked over and stood beside Julian, facing Mundus. "What a surprising visit, Mundus," Julian said with a smile, offering his hand. They shook. "Let's talk away from prying eyes," Mundus said. He'd never been one for formalities, few words, always direct. "Of course," Julian said, opening the door to Nick's office. The three of them went in, Nick and Julian behind the desk, Mundus across from it. Nick was used to dangerous situations, but sitting across from a hero who had no great fondness for Dark Dream still put him on edge. Anatomy had the worst relationship with Dark Dream of any manufacturer, not enemies exactly, but it was no secret they wanted to swallow Dark Dream whole. To them, it was just a fat piece of meat. "So what brings you here?" Julian asked, smiling. Mundus said nothing for a few seconds, looking between them. Nick recognized the tactic immediately. Silence under a steep power imbalance tended to rattle the weaker side. He'd used it himself, on troublesome employees and in negotiations with smaller companies. 3 months ago, Mundus finally said, there was an incident involving the Forbidden Zone to the north. Julian and Nick could already guess where this was going, and if they were right, this meant real money. "You already know what happened," Mundus continued. "What you don't know is that Blitz has been searching hard for an opening to capture the Specter. It isn't easy, the North is largely unknown, and sending a hero risks losing one. Sending more improves the odds but risks Blitz itself. They've managed to capture only 2 of its minions in 3 months, both elder level. Progress is slow, but as the strongest manufacturer by far, Blitz believes time is on their side. If they're not confident, no one is. They'll take a decade if they have to." "That's our opening," Mundus said. "Who's our?" Nick asked neutrally. Julian said nothing, watching. Mundus turned to Nick, and the air in the room tightened, though Nick stayed as calm as anyone could facing him. "Depending on your answer, that includes you," Mundus said. That confirmed Julian and Nick's guess. This was a real opportunity. Chapter 428, most likely. "Please continue," Julian said, smiling. Mundus turned back to him. Blitz's progress is slow, and Anatomy intends to capitalize on that. If they won't grab the Specter, we will. That said, it's proven it can rival a level 6 extractor, dangerous enough that we won't risk a confrontation without better information. He looked at Nick. "That's where Dark Dream comes in. There's been no reliable way to lure its minions out. Blitz hasn't found one. It seems the only method involves you." His eyes held Nick's. "Do you have a way to attract more of its minions?" Loaded question. This almost certainly touched on envy. If Nick admitted the Specter was specifically interested in him, Mundus would want to know why, and if a level 6 or 7 Specter cared about a mere veteran, Anatomy might start wanting whatever that reason was for themselves. But denying it outright risked its own problems. Suspicion over why Dark Dream would pass up a chance at several free Specters, or simply losing Mundus's interest entirely. Every answer carried risk. "Yes," Nick said. Mundus's eyes narrowed slightly. "Would you be interested in selling this method to us?" "I'm sorry," Nick said, declining. "Even for 3 adults?" Julian chuckled. "Drop it, Mundus. We're not selling, only renting." Silence. "What a shame," Mundus said eventually. "But I'm still interested in renting it. What results should we expect?" Julian leaned back, making it clear he wouldn't be the one answering, and Mundus turned to Nick. He remembered how the previous CEO, one of Vernon's progenies, had valued this odd little extractor with the doubled name, Nick. Now even a specialist like Julian trusted him enough to let him speak for Dark Dream in most matters, even sending him alone to the big yearly meeting as their sole representative. Maybe there really was something to this Nick. Nick furrowed his brows, working out his answer. "We can't be entirely sure," he said. "Too many variables. The biggest is the Specter's intelligence. It's shown a high level of it, which makes its actions hard to predict." He paused, thinking it through. How would the mysterious Specter to the north actually behave? If it really was one of Envy's servants, it would want to seize any real chance at Nick. Because if Envy learned it hadn't tried its hardest, it would kill the thing outright. But charging straight into the city was clearly too dangerous, or it would have done so already. It needed to take Nick without attacking the city directly. The first time, it sent a couple of experts and a specialist. The second time, 2 specialists. But with several specialists and experts already captured, it now knew the humans to its south were on high alert. Sending more minions south had grown far riskier. The smartest move would be to hold back entirely and strike only once the humans grew complacent again. So it would need an incentive too good to pass up. Was Nick that incentive? Maybe. He put himself in the Specter's position. Most likely a demon, a fallen would be far more aggressive. Attacking risked losing even more minions, and this was clearly a Specter that valued its own, much like the parasite. Lose all its minions, and it would take a devastating hit to its Zephyx. Every minion was an investment. Losing 2 specialists had already hurt. Losing 2 more might embolden the humans to actually invade, a genuinely dangerous outcome for it. But refusing to act if envy found out could mean death. With Specters as servants, following through on threats mattered above everything. An empty threat meant no one would ever obey again. Envy had to kill problem servants to keep the rest in line. So the Northern Specter was trapped either way, under real pressure. What would I do here? Nick thought, turning it over for a few seconds before answering. Most likely, he said, the Specter will attack with everything it has or close to it. Alternatively, nothing happens at all. I don't think there's an in-between, it's all or nothing. He looked at Mundus. The Specter's minions are the people who have gone missing over the years, from what I understand. Mundus didn't dispute it. And since at least one hero has vanished there before, I'd expect at least 2 heroes in the attack, the vanished hero itself, and the Specter, likely a demon. If there's another hero-level minion, that one shows up too. That's what I think will happen, Nick said. Mundus, Anatomy's only hero, studied him with a neutral expression. Chapter 429, The Three. 2 weeks passed after Mundus's visit. After extensive negotiation, Dark Dream and Anatomy struck a deal. Nick would help Anatomy in exchange for Specters. The reward tiered since nobody could be sure how the Northern Specter would react. Nothing happening meant nothing gained. A weak response meant 1 Specter. A strong response meant 2. And if Nick's involvement directly helped capture it, Dark Dream stood to gain a great deal. Anatomy's offer was generous, and for good reason. Success meant their first demon, which would let all 3 of Anatomy's founders advance into the hero stage and stop Cujoblitz from pulling further ahead. This was the most important mission Anatomy had attempted in decades. They weren't about to let a few Specters for Dark Dream get in the way. Given the relationship between the 2 companies, an insurance clause was written in. Anatomy was responsible for Nick's safety, and if he died on their watch, they'd owe Dark Dream a fanatic and 2 elders. Dark Dream couldn't really put those to use, so it wasn't really about the payout. It was about giving Anatomy a real incentive not to let Nick accidentally die. Julian kept a copy of the contract. So did the city. Even the governor was informed. Despite the risk, he was closely tied to Cujoblitz, but Dark Dream had insisted, and there was leverage on their side too. Cujoblitz could use the law against Anatomy for risking integral city forces for personal gain by chasing the Specter with their own extractors. Still, the odds of the secret reaching Cujoblitz stayed low. The governor answered to Aegis before anyone else, and Aegis didn't love monopolies. They produced less Zephyx overall, meaning less revenue for the city. Better to have at least 1 manufacturer capable of standing up to the top dog. And if the secret leaked and Cujoblitz stole the prize, Anatomy would raise hell across the city, something the governor had every reason to avoid. Keeping quiet served him. That didn't mean he owed Anatomy any active help, though his dependence on Cujoblitz didn't stretch that far. Overstepping would let Cujoblitz twist the rules, cut him off from the Crimson Fungus, and eventually arrange a quiet assassination. Ghosty's lab couldn't help either, simply for lack of strength to threaten a demon. Only Cujoblitz, Anatomy, and the governor carried that kind of weight, and Anatomy was on its own. 2 weeks after the negotiation, Nick waited in Dark Dream's main hall. According to Mundus, today was the day. Anatomy was making its move on the demon to the north. After a few minutes, a muscular man in Anatomy's green uniform walked in, serious and unsmiling, a veteran by his insignia. He spotted Nick quickly. "Follow me," he said flatly without greeting and turned to leave. Nick's expression didn't change as he followed in silence. The man picked up the pace, and they ran to the western part of the city, slowing as he calmly entered an unassuming house near the city's edge. Nick stepped in behind him and the door shut on its own. Inside, the house looked ordinary enough. "Nick," a cold, deep voice called from one of the rooms. Nick glanced at the still motionless veteran beside him, then walked toward the voice. The room told him 3 things at a glance. It was massive, taking up nearly the entire first floor. A large hole sat at its center, constantly leaking red mist from the Crimson Sea, and 3 people stood beside that hole, watching him with identical, unreadable eyes. Under their combined gaze, the pressure was enormous. These three owned and ran anatomy. Mundus Stairwell, tall, black-haired, looking to be in his 30s, holding 40% of the company as its chief Zephyx Extractor and only hero. Zarin Harrow, also tall and black-haired, apparently in his 30s, holding 30% as one of two senior directors and an extremely powerful specialist. Nick already knew both of them. The third he'd never met in person. A small woman with icy blue hair, her expression just as cold as the other two, seemingly in her 30s as well. He'd never seen her before, but he knew the name. Ariel Cerulean, Anatomy's other senior director like Zarin, an extremely powerful specialist. The three of them owned Anatomy outright and decided everything about how it ran. "Are you ready to leave?" Mundus asked, looking at Nick.